The committee will now come to order. Today, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology is holding our first hearing of the 117th Congress entitled Connecting America, Broadband Solutions to Our Pandemic Problems. Before we get started, I just want to, express all of our concern for these weather emergencies occurring down in Texas and throughout the Midwest. Our thoughts are with all of those folks, and I know Dr. Anderson in Kansas, there's been rolling blackouts, and the governor of Kansas declared a state of emergency, and I think the schools in Topeka are closed this week. You might be able to fill us in during your testimony. But anyways, I just want to express our concern for that, for all the folks that are going through that hardship right now, and hope they get power restored quick. Before I get started, I want to welcome some of our new and returning members on the Democratic side, including Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who's just joined the subcommittee. She's not new to Energy and Commerce, but she's new to the subcommittee. So I want to welcome Robin. I also want to welcome Congresswoman Angie Craig, Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, who are all new to the committee this Congress. I'm happy to have all of you join us. I also want to welcome our new and returning Republican members to the subcommittee, especially my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Bob Latta. It's good to have you back. And Bob, during your time, I'm sure you can introduce your new members of the committee. We'll certainly give you time to do that. I look forward to working with all of you as we take on the important work of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. So back to the matter at hand. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing, and as part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Joe Orlando at the email address we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. So the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. As we have all become far too aware over the last year, universal broadband connectivity is critical to our economy, to our education of our youth, and to keeping our communities safe and connected during this unprecedented crisis. Americans throughout the country have struggled to get connected and stay connected. Too many households are going without broadband service because they can't afford it, either because it was too expensive before or it's too expensive now. Free Press, in their testimony, says that some 77 million people lack an adequate home internet connection due to high prices or lack of connectivity. We all know that our nation needs to invest in deploying new networks, particularly rural communities, if we're going to ensure that everyone can get online. But what I think is more concerning about the data presented in their testimony is that far too many people go without because they can't afford service. That's why I'm glad we were finally able to come together at the end of last year to include several important broadband provisions in the COVID bus package to address these challenges. Among our accomplishments was the creation of a new emergency program, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, based on legislation introduced by our colleague, Congressman Vesey. This $3.2 billion program will provide qualifying consumers with a $50 credit each month on their broadband bills. Congress wrote this legislation to give consumers a great deal of flexibility in how they use this benefit, and it's critical that the program be implemented as such. I also hope the FCC will ensure that existing tools that are helpful and part of the Lifeline program are available and accessible to participating carriers to the greatest extent possible to help facilitate this new program as well. While the emergency broadband benefit is temporary, I sincerely hope we can work together to find permanent solutions to ensuring that broadband service is available and affordable to all. Last week, this committee marked up legislation to fund remote learning in our nation's classrooms. This investment is long overdue, and we have known about the homework gap for years, and the pandemic has really laid this inequality bare. The new $7.6 billion Emergency Connectivity Fund seeks to start closing that gap. The fund will help low-income students by subsidizing the cost of internet-connected devices and broadband service so that students can learn at home. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you talk about the great lengths schools are going to keep students connected, including setting up Wi-Fi in school parking lots. But as you point out, too many students, and more importantly, their parents, can't sit in a parking lot all day. It's critical that we give students and families the resources they need to allow kids to participate in their own education. It's my hope we can get these provisions signed into law as quickly as possible and get help to students and schools in need. And finally, as we have all said for many years, we need to invest in rural broadband. We have had more hearings than I care to count where the truth has been obvious. The only way to solve this problem is through federal investment. The business case just does not exist for too many communities. Last Congress, House passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which included $100 billion for broadband deployment and adoption. I hope we can work with the Biden administration and our colleagues in the Senate to take up similar legislation again this Congress and finally take real steps in this country to close the digital divide. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we take all of these challenges on together. And with that, I will yield the remainder of my time to my good friend from Vermont, Congressman Peter Welsh.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. And I think all of us on the committee, Republicans and Democrats, are thrilled that you're starting out with this hearing. The issue of broadband is existential. The case has been made. Many of us on this committee sent a letter to the president to support rural broadband. But what you're pointing out is that broadband is an equity issue. And it's not just getting access in rural America, it's getting affordability in urban America. So here we are with you from Pittsburgh, me from rural Vermont, and we have the same challenge. So this is about equity. And there has to be two things. One, federal investment. That's number one. But number two, local partnerships. Now, we can partner with the private companies, but let me give an example. If they're not going to do the job, get out of the way. Let local communities that are developing their own co-ops move ahead. If you live in Peacham, Vermont, very small town, and you're on one side of Max Mountain, Charter Spectrum will not answer your call and get you the broadband. So this is about equity for all of our citizens in rural and urban America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we all look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mr. Welsh. It gives me great pleasure now to recognize my good friend and colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, our ranking member for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technologies, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Mr. Latta, you are recognized.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate my good friend for recognizing me this morning, and congratulations again for your leadership on the subcommittee, and also want to thank and recognize Mr. Pallone for his continued leadership as chairman of the full committee. But also, thanks very much for our witnesses for being on hand today. Greatly appreciate it. And also, if I could just make mention of our new members on the subcommittee, greatly appreciate it. Mr. Duncan, Mr. Hudson, Mr. Mullen, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Curtis, and Mr. Carter. And I know they're all going to do a great job being on the committee. It's a great subcommittee with us, and so I look forward to it. But the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the importance of reliable internet access as so much of our daily lives has moved online. From telehealth to education, closing the digital divide for all Americans has never been more critical. But even before the pandemic changed the way we live, work, and learn, Americans, especially those who live in rural communities, were being left behind because of their lack of access to the internet. In June of last year, I called on the majority to hold this hearing because people across the country and Ohioans in my district need better access to the internet so they can participate in the 21st century economy, get the health care they need from home, and learn remotely. While our schools remain closed to in-person learning, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to also submit the letter for the record that I have before us. But even as this hearing is long overdue, it is better late than never, and I am pleased we are having it today. Before moving forward, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us. One of the most evident needs for improving broadband during the pandemic is our country's unprecedented reliance on telehealth. Telehealth services allow Americans to continue to see their doctors without risk of contracting the coronavirus. Congress appropriated over $500 million to the FCC's COVID-19 telehealth program last year, and now we must pursue aggressive oversight to understand how the emergency funding is being used to ensure needs are being met. In my district, telehealth visits have spiked since the start of the pandemic last March, and I am sure we're seeing similar trends in my colleagues' districts. This includes more than just primary care visits, but also assessing mental health resources and substance abuse mistreatment, as rates of suicide, drug abuse, and alcoholism are on the rise. For all Americans to benefit from telehealth services, we must close the digital divide with long-term solutions. Under the last administration, the gap between urban and rural Americans with access to broadband closed significantly. Americans with access to 25.3 megabits per second fixed broadband fell from 30 percentage points at the end of the Obama administration in 2016 to just 16 points to the end of 2019. Thanks to Republican policies and historic tax cuts that encouraged private investments, providers were well positioned to immediately step up to the challenge presented by the once-in-a-century crisis. While this regulatory flexibility enabled broadband providers to immediately upgrade their services for consumers, earlier this week, ENC Republicans introduced the Boosting Broadband Connectivity Agenda, a package of broadband infrastructure and permitting reform bills to make sure broadband gets to all Americans quickly. We urge committee Democrats to join us in solving these important issues in a bipartisan fashion. We often hear from our colleagues across the aisle about the need to get broadband to the home, particularly for low-income Americans in urban America. We agree and work with you all to provide $3.2 billion at the end of last year to increase broadband access for all those Americans. While no American should have to go to a fast food restaurant for internet, at least those Americans have access to it. Many of my constituents don't even have that option. We must close the digital divide once and for all. The COVID-19 pandemic has required novel approaches to address new problems, but we can't forget about challenges that persisted before the pandemic that still demand our attention. Internet connectivity and access are topics we must tackle together because they will be required for generations to come. So thank you again to all my friends in the majority for holding this hearing today, and I look forward to today's discussion and thanking our witnesses again. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would like to also recognize one of our new members on the Democratic side from the great state of New York, Congresswoman Rice. Sorry for missing you there, Catherine, but we're thrilled to have you on the committee. Now, the chair will recognize Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Right now, struggling families that lack internet connectivity have been shut out from school, work, telehealth, and other vital connections. And across the country, children are unable to attend virtual classes because they don't have a reliable internet connection. In New Jersey, for example, studies have found that nearly 17% of residents have no internet access in their homes. Of the families making $35,000 per year or less, only half have home internet connections, and for many school kids, the dining room table or a bedroom workspace have replaced their classrooms, so a lack of connectivity means that, in essence, they're locked out of school. And it's not just kids. Struggling parents are trying to fill out job applications and complete educational courses on smartphones. Many, if not most, vaccine appointments require online registration. And to make matters worse, many libraries that once provided a reliable internet connection are now closed to protect public health. But nowhere in this is this problem more acute than on tribal lands. Many tribal students who were sent home from college and schools for their own safety returned to homes without sufficient internet connections for video conferencing or uploading assignments. And many tribal members can't work from home or sell goods online, cutting off key sources of income. And these same tribal communities are also among the last to receive important updates on health and emergency procedures, which are critically important for prevention. Fortunately, Mr. Chairman, Democrats and Republicans came together at the end of the last Congress to pass the historic Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. Under this program, eligible households can receive a discount of $50 per month for service or $75 per month for service on tribal lands, and the Federal Communications Commission is in the process of setting this program up. We also passed, as you know, the Broadband Connectivity Grant Program in that end of the year package that provides $1 billion for a range of efforts to increase connectivity on tribal lands. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration is working to set up that program now, including significant tribal consultation. And then just last week, this committee approved, as part of the reconciliation instructions, $7.6 billion in funding to expand E-rate assistance for remote learning and remote library services. And we all want the schools and libraries to open, but we have to ensure they're open safely. And until that's possible, we have to prevent our kids from falling into the homework gap. And this funding in the reconciliation bill will allow millions of teachers, students, and families to access the technology and tools they need to participate in virtual classrooms and other online activities. So we're going to continue to support broadband deployment across the country through another infrastructure bill or economic stimulus, which I think will follow the budget reconciliation, hopefully on a bipartisan basis in April or May. That I think will incorporate a lot of the things that we did in our committee in the Moving Forward Act, which was passed by the House last year, but we couldn't get the Senate Majority Leader then, Mitch McConnell, to move it in the Senate. But I think that a lot of our Republican members will support a major infrastructure bill that has some major broadband deployment in underserved areas. So I look forward to continue to find bipartisan solutions, Chairman Doyle, and I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Mark Veazey of Texas.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for recognizing me. I want to, first of all, thank you for gathering us here today to talk about this extremely important topic about broadband expansion, because right now, this pandemic is more important than ever that we have fast, reliable internet. Our lives are primarily taking place online with work, school, and healthcare, and not to mention basic communication between friends and families. So we have to make sure that our kids don't get caught in the homework gap, and to make sure that our workers can find their next job online, and that we don't lose meaningful communication with one another. Last year, I introduced legislation to bolster access to broadband for individuals that are facing unprecedented challenges amidst the coronavirus pandemic. My legislation provides free or low-cost internet service to families with children who qualify for free or reduced school lunch, to college students who have Pell Grants, and to those who have been laid off or furloughed due to COVID-19, and those that qualify for the FCC's current Lifeline program. And I was very proud that my legislation was included in the sweeping stimulus package that Congress passed at the end of last year to give Americans immediate relief. In the upcoming months, I will continue to use my position on this committee to work with the incoming administration to ensure we facilitate a good rollout of this program, because I believe it's in everyone's interest. And I wanted to thank everyone on the committee for all of their well wishes and prayers for everything that we're going through in Texas right now. I don't ever remember it being this cold here, and there are a lot of people out here suffering. So thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And now I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's my understanding Mrs. Rogers was unable to attend, and that my friend from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Johnson, is going to claim her time. So, Mr. Johnson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning, Chairman Doyle and Chairman Pallone. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic that has had and all the terrible effects that it's had on our country's broadband networks. It is certainly time that this committee holds a hearing to examine ways to close the digital divide and the homework gap, which House Energy and Commerce Committee Republicans urged you to hold last year in a letter to both you and Chairman Pallone. And though it took nearly a year, I'm glad we're finally turning our attention to this matter. These are two crucial issues facing Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter the letter that was sent last year into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, our broadband networks have held our economy, our education system, and our communities together where access has been available. Despite the challenges that many American industries have faced, our nation's broadband providers stepped up when it mattered most. And they were able to do this because our country's policies allowed them to do so. The past 4 years of Republican-led, market-oriented policies created a competitive environment that facilitates innovation and investment in our networks, leading to increased speeds, extra capacity, lower prices, and flexibility to adapt when faced with the unexpected. I can think of no greater test than the early challenges of the pandemic. More than 40% of America's workforce began working and learning from home overnight. Children began streaming classes and their favorite TV shows around the clock. Parents were juggling video calls with video weddings and reunions, family reunions, and even Congress began legislating over WebEx. All of the capacity that had been dedicated to office parks now suddenly needed to be made available at homes on short notice. And in a stunning show of American ingenuity, our providers kept the internet up and running at full speed while other major countries in Europe failed. I commend all of the providers who continue to work around the clock to ensure Americans have the connectivity they need. Our country's policies foster a competitive communications marketplace, and this competition only benefits consumers. Now, we're not there yet. In most rural areas of America, while bipartisan policies led by Republicans have enabled the ISPs to do much good work with existing broadband infrastructure, there are many places throughout our country that do not have even the basic access to the 21st century digital economy, and we must continue to solve that problem. Thankfully, we do not have socialized broadband in this country yet. In fact, as long as we continue to push bipartisan policies, we'll continue to move in the opposite direction from a socialized solution. Last summer, committee Republicans worked with our Republican colleagues in the Senate to outline a framework that would help connect all Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. We then worked with many of our colleagues here today to find bipartisan agreement to enact many of them into law, including establishing a $1.3 billion broadband grant program to connect unserved rural and tribes, increasing broadband access and digital opportunities in minority communities and for low-income Americans, increasing funding for telehealth programs, and providing funding for broadband maps and to secure our networks. Though not in this committee's jurisdiction, Congress also funded a cumulative $110 billion to the Department of Education to invest in hardware, software, and connectivity needed to safely reopen schools and continue remote learning. Mr. Chairman, it is our duty to now make sure that money gets to where it belongs, to Americans. Let's not abandon the American people when it matters most. We must make sure that money already appropriated gets to our children for distance learning. Without that, our efforts are in vain. But there is more that can be done. With billions of dollars dedicated to connecting unserved Americans, we must now move swiftly to turbocharge that investment by removing barriers to deployment. We can start by working together to pass the boosting broadband connectivity agenda that committee Republicans unveiled this week. This agenda sets out an ambitious slate of proposals designed to roll back regulatory red tape, to put Americans back to work building next generation networks and maintain U.S. broadband leadership. We have proven that when we work together, we can help Americans in need. I hope my colleagues across the aisle will join us in this effort to encourage speedy, affordable broadband deployment so all Americans can be connected. Thank you for being here today, and thank you again, Chairman Doyle, for holding this important hearing. Better late than never. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Now, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses for today's hearing. Dr. Tiffany Anderson, Superintendent of the Topeka Public Schools, welcome. Mr. Matthew Wood, Vice President of Policy and General Counsel, Free Press Action of Pittsburgher, who has testified before this subcommittee many times. Welcome back. Jonathan Adelson, President and CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, who has also testified before us, both in his roles in government and in his current role many times. Welcome back, John. And last but certainly not least, Chris Shelton, President of the Communication Workers of America. Chris, it's good to have you back also. I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today, and we look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Well, I guess we don't have the lights up there anymore, do we, guys? Try to stick to your 5-minute time limit. I'll let you know if you've gone over a little bit too much. We'll start with Dr. Anderson. You're now recognized for 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Dr. Anderson.
Yes, sir. I'm making sure I was off mute. First of all, good afternoon. It is a pleasure and privilege to be here. I have to tell you what, I'm so filled up hearing people talk about collective energy and moving together to move forward in this area of addressing broadband. With that in mind, let me first extend an apology in that we sent an amended statement to you, as was stated at the beginning by Senator Doyle. Thank you for the comments about Kansas. We are on a blackout. So look, I'm just glad to see y'all this morning. And if we go out, I have a couple of hot spots right here because they run by battery. But I will tell you that like other states, we actually are on a scheduled blackout. Therefore, rather than you being with me in Topeka in my office, you're right here in my home. And as I talk, I'm going to really try to touch base on a few things. One, kind of giving you a feel of not just Kansans, but people around the country really in terms of how we are addressing matters that we are faced with now. But I will tell you this, that the need for broadband, which has already been said, it's not new. This is something that we have needed for some time. And as we look at the homework gap, it's existed. It's a reason for the achievement gap. And where we are now, it's just shining a bright light on things that we need to do. So I have to say in advance, thank you for the steps you've already taken. In Topeka Public Schools, I come with you with the energy of about 30,000 people, a little bit over 13,000 are students and the rest are parents and community members. And I will share with you prior to the pandemic, we were one-to-one technology. We had a multi-million-dollar bond. We had one-to-one technology for our students, pre-K through 12. We were what you'd consider a future-ready district like many districts. We recognize that providing resources within the schools were key, but I will tell you for 73% free lunch students, just providing that at school has never been enough. And I'll tell you why. And even after the pandemic, I want you to remember this because we're in this space now, which is shining a light, but after this, we are still in a space of making sure that we need to provide some level of permanent opportunity in the future for people to access resources at home and outside of school. With that, as we started in Topeka this last couple of years during the pandemic and we had the shutdown, as has already been said, we gave families maps of the city to share where Wi-Fi was. We provided hotspots on buses. We learned very quickly from our families at Quincy Elementary, man, I wish y'all could be with me in Topeka talking right now, but you can't. So I'm going to tell you about some students and some families. And I tell you what, at Quincy, several of the families live at the rescue mission. We have 400 homeless families. They don't have broadband in that space. Therefore, they needed hotspots. So through our district, we will be able to provide some limited access to that support just for students to be able to get online. That's for those families. But again, in 73% free lunch and certainly in our rural areas, you also have some transiency throughout the community. So families that move to different homes. And again, if you don't have broadband, how are you going to access school? Moving from that, as we now go into this next year, we have created a variety of opportunities. We have telehealth sessions, night school, morning school. We have students that access from work the services that we provide. And so here's reality. Right now, we are certainly in need, and not just in Topeka, but certainly all of rural America as well. You know, I thought when we first closed down that we need to really focus just on our students and getting them ready. And then I know that one of our teachers, the vice president of the NEA, couldn't access the internet. Why? Because she lives in rural America. She could drive to school and fix that, but her students could not. I want to tell you about Krishayla Adams, and Krishayla was just in DC being awarded for the JAG, Jobs for American Graduates. See, she wants to graduate early, but to do that, she has to take classes at night, virtually. And so before the pandemic, we had virtual schools operating. So we have had this need, and this homework gap has been created, but now it's exponential. So I ask and give you a plea from Topeka, but from all of our educators, our teachers, and our students, to really put the kind of resources that allow for expanded connectivity, that also allow for us to support students that are marginalized, such as our Native American students, our students in poverty, our rural American students. But all students deserve the access and the civil right to an education. Right now, they don't all have it. If you have resources, when the pandemic is over, you'll be able to access night school and tutoring and all of those other things, ACT tutoring. So when the pandemic is over, I'm asking you to continue to look at this issue, put resources behind it, and I welcome any questions. In addition to being superintendent of Topeka Public Schools, I also serve on the post-secondary Education Authority for the governor, and I also serve on the Commission for Racial Equity and Justice. This is an equity and opportunity gap, and I believe that you will help us close it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wood, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Pallone and Ranking Member Latta, and it's an honor to be appearing before the subcommittee again. Of course, appearing today means on your screens, not in Rayburn, where I think we'd all rather be. And in a sense, that's just what this hearing is about. I can afford good enough internet service for 3 kids to attend school from home, one of them at the table with me now, in fact, and for me to join you online this morning too. But why can people who look like me more easily pay for this service while it's still out of reach for nearly a quarter of the people in this country? The answer is all too obvious. COVID has changed everything in some ways, as social distance showed beyond a doubt that broadband is an essential utility for learning and livelihoods. Yet it's also changed nothing, merely highlighting and heightening the racial injustice and income inequality at our country's root. Measuring the digital divide depends on how we count people with mobile phones alone. But as Chairman Doyle said, our read of US Census data shows that more than 77 million people lack adequate home connections today. This divide is based on income for sure. 9 of 10 in the top income bracket are online. Only 2/3 in the bottom bracket are. And that group is overly reliant on mobile. Just 48% of low income people have wired broadband. But we're divided by race and ethnicity too. 26% of white people lack wired broadband at home, compared to 34% of Black people, 35% of Latinx people, and 41% of Indigenous people. So 13 million Black people, 18 million Latinx people, and 13 million Indigenous Americans are without the broadband services they need. This means affordability is an even bigger challenge than rural deployment. Non-adopters in rural and urban areas surpass the number who lack physical access to broadband. That's why Mr. VC's emergency broadband benefit legislation, passed in the December spending and stimulus bill, was a landmark bipartisan achievement. It provides up to $50 a month or $75 on tribal lands for any plan an eligible household can buy from participating ISPs. That's enough to give people better options and connect many who've never been online or who lost service in the pandemic. That number spared disconnection by the previous FCC's pledge, by the way, as best as we can tell from rough estimates, with something like 1 or 2 million people. And that's a lot, but it's relatively few compared to the country as a whole. Yet that's likely because many people most impacted by COVID were already offline, so they couldn't lose what they already lacked. Why are so many still unconnected? Well, it's high prices, plain and simple, in addition to the other barriers that members have mentioned this morning. Many people, including many of us here today, likely can't even say precisely what we pay for broadband. That's because we may pay for it with less hardship, but also because broadband is often bundled with other services at promotional rates that vanish over time, and with modem rental charges, overage, and other fees tacked on. But even through that haze, we see concerning reports about price hikes and renewed data caps, all while big ISPs make record profits. Broadband has been a pandemic-proof business in peak demand, with ISPs' revenues rising and their subscriber rolls growing. We need the FCC to collect more granular pricing data for sure to get the full picture. But what we do have is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditures Survey, which shows average US internet bills increased 19% in the first 3 years of the Trump administration. That means nominal broadband prices rose at more than 4 times the rate of inflation. Wireless prices over that span weren't quite as bleak, but with the T-Mobile Sprint merger closing last April, the wireless consumer price index spiked 4.1% in 2020. No other annual increase had exceeded 1% since tracking began in 1998. Coincidence? Not likely. Prices are rising for entry-level tiers too, and FCC data shows rates for lower-priced standalone broadband up 20% in 5 years, more than double the rate of inflation, while it's up 50% in some cities. So the big question is, what can we do? And part of that, of course, the emergency broadband benefit, but there are more things as well. Stopping the prior FCC's attacks on Lifeline is a start, but we need bigger permanent broadband benefits that come with the progressive sustainable funding source, not increased regressive contributions. We also need lower prices and increased choice from competition policy, and restored FCC authority so the agency can do more than just ask ISPs to pledge just and reasonable service for all. My written testimony details the failed efforts of the past 4 years, explaining that the prior FCC chairman didn't actually spur broadband deployment or decrease prices like he claimed. In fact, investment declined every year of Chairman Pai's tenure. AT&T investment dropped 20% in 2020, and it's 52% down from its peak in the last year for the Obama FCC. Comcast dropped 4.5% last year, down 22% from 2016. But even if deregulation alone had increased deployment, and it didn't, build-out alone would not lower price or increase adoption in the absence of competition, oversight, and more robust adoption subsidies. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wood. Chair now recognizes Mr. Edelstein. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. WI certainly shares your goal of ensuring that all communities benefit from broadband. And this subcommittee has shown great leadership to do just that. You're taking this rare opportunity to address long-standing inequities, as Congressman Welch noted, and you can now build the best workforce to expand broadband across the country. WI applauds your efforts. I've heard every witness agree and every member agree that the pandemic underscored the importance of broadband like never before. From virtual school to working from home to telemedicine, connectivity is essential. And as a result, the pandemic generated unprecedented demand for wireless services. And the wireless industry is meeting the challenge. The networks performed exceedingly well thanks to massive investments our industry made in infrastructure, like no other industry. As bad as the pandemic hit our families and businesses, just think how much worse it would have been before the era of broadband. Think back just 10 or 20 years ago. This hearing wouldn't be possible. I think our economy and quality of life would have collapsed. Congress, the FCC, and the industry worked together over many years with this committee in the lead role to make this happen. It was a miracle. Yet, as we've heard today, a large portion of this country, particularly communities of color and rural areas, still don't have access to broadband or can't afford it. The negative economic and social consequences for those left behind contrast with the many businesses and finances that were saved by broadband and working from home. Some rural residents, of course, are left without economic opportunities, and the homework gap hurts too many students. This subcommittee took real impactful action we've heard about today from the leaders of the committee to address the digital divide, from funding accurate maps to telehealth programs to helping minority and underserved communities to the emergency broadband benefit program, and of course last week's amazing action on the emergency connectivity fund. Now, the pandemic only exacerbated the damage of the digital divide. WI's mission is to work with you to find a sustainable solution so that all communities can benefit. I think that Congress can really build upon your longstanding efforts to expand broadband deployment. And given the dramatic benefits we've seen in the pandemic, sufficient subsidies for deployment are needed. I think legislation along the magnitude of Majority Whip Jim Clyburn's Affordable Internet for All Act is warranted. The connectivity package released yesterday by committee Republicans also includes a lot of helpful policies. So we'll work with all of you to promote broadband infrastructure legislation that's designed to meet the challenge. I think it can be developed in a bipartisan manner, given the broad level of support it enjoys among so many on the subcommittee. An infrastructure package should make the best use of co-location, which efficiently leverages existing infrastructure and capital for new infrastructure as well, while reducing disruption to local communities. Congress should ensure that funds can be used for operational expenses, such as leases as well as capital expenses, and hold recipients accountable for outcomes. And it should be technology neutral, building infrastructure with the most cost-efficient means to get the most bandwidth to the most consumers. As part of making historic investments like this in infrastructure, I think you can really also prioritize building a more skilled workforce with good new jobs that you create, workers that can meet the new demands of the latest 5G and broadband technology. You have an opportunity to put Americans hurt by the pandemic back to work in high-wage jobs that provide opportunities for advancement. And as the wireless industry continues to grow, these workers will speed the economic recovery and they'll grow along with us. So funding in any infrastructure package should support employers and programs that adopt registered apprenticeships, a proven technique that is ideally suited to broadband. That'll help us develop the skills needed to deploy quickly, efficiently, and absolutely safely. Congress can seize this opportunity to reskill dislocated workers, to diversify the workforce, to do these jobs. We look forward to working with CWA President Shelton and the labor community to grow this workforce together. Along with supporting employers, Congress should strengthen programs at institutions of higher education, such as community and technical colleges, HBCUs, and TCUs. Academic institutions haven't kept pace with how fast our industry's grown. I think Congress can fund partnerships driven by employers with educational institutions that can develop programs on broadband and 5G. And here's some news. A new Gallup poll will be released today. It found that 90% of the public supports investing in the broadband workforce as a priority, with overwhelming majorities from both parties, 90%. That's big news. Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta, we certainly appreciate your focus on these critical issues. I look forward to continuing our work with you in the subcommittee because I really believe together we can make progress on our shared goal of expanding broadband across both rural and urban America and to all of our citizens, especially those in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And last but certainly not least, we have Chris Shelton. Mr. Shelton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. CWA represents hundreds of thousands of workers, including more than 150,000 employees in wireline and wireless telecommunications. My own experience in the industry goes back to 1968, when I was hired by New York Telephone as a technician. I've worked in telecommunications and represented telecom employees my entire adult life. The pandemic has made something clear to people across the country that CWA members have known for a long time. Affordable, reliable broadband internet connections are critical for all Americans, yet millions of families do not have access to these connections. We are living in an America where if you have $10,000 to spend on an ad in the Wall Street Journal, you can get quality internet access at home. But if you're a single mom struggling to pay the bills, your children have to sit in a McDonald's parking lot using the free Wi-Fi to do their homework. This problem has been years in the making and was exacerbated by deregulation across the industry as major telecom companies allowed their networks to deteriorate and failed to upgrade low-income communities to fiber optic service. In 2006, CWA called for better FCC broadband maps, faster broadband speeds, a strong lifeline subsidy program, and robust public investment to spur broadband deployment. We also worked with partners to address the fact that the digital divide also harmed many urban communities of color excluded from fiber broadband networks. And here we are 15 years later, still discussing the same issues. Had our recommendations been enacted, we might not be facing the challenges the pandemic has exacerbated. This committee's work, including the recent enactment of an emergency broadband benefit and last week's directive for E-rate funding, is a good start. But I know the majority of this committee agrees that more must be done to achieve lasting structural change. For example, we must strengthen the Lifeline program and protect the millions of consumers who rely on it. We must fight efforts to undercut it, like making funding contingent on the annual congressional appropriations process. We must modernize Lifeline so that the digital divide does not get worse. Today, the funding mechanism that supports the USF is unsustainable because it levies fees only on traditional voice service, despite the shift to broadband. The Commission should explore options, including broadening the USF funding base in order to fulfill the promise of universal service. And companies must not be allowed to shirk their responsibility to provide affordable access through Lifeline. For example, as proposed, the Verizon TracFone transaction could curtail availability of the Lifeline program for millions of low-income consumers. Even a strengthened Lifeline won't be enough without bold action to reinvigorate broadband deployment. Major telecom companies' lack of investment has made the digital divide worse. My written testimony describes AT&T's merger build-out. The company, once the leader in universal service, has made fiber to the home available for fewer than 1/3 of the households in its 21-state network. While many have placed enormous faith in the idea of competition in this sector, competition alone is not an adequate solution to ensure universal access in a capital-intensive industry like telecommunications. We need an infrastructure bill that will expand broadband access and create and protect good jobs, as President Biden has laid out in his plan to build back better. This means $80 billion in funding, as in Whip Clyburn's Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act, to help close the digital divide. The bill sets standards that ensure the workers who build and maintain federally subsidized broadband networks can exercise their collective bargaining rights free from employer coercion and intimidation. The bill also prohibits outsourcing of work with the intent of circumventing a collective bargaining agreement. This provision addresses the growing trend of major broadband companies avoiding accountability by contracting and subcontracting work, harming workers and consumers in the process. CWA members who build, maintain, and service our telecom networks know better than anyone how broadband policy can help address the struggles our nation faces. We are grateful that the Biden administration and congressional Democrats have begun to take the necessary steps to address these glaring digital inequities and the pandemic has exposed. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. We will now, this is concluded opening statements. We have concluded our witness statements, and we're going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Wood, Congress established the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program in December of last year. This program allocated $3.2 billion to provide low-income consumers with $50 a month on their benefit on their broadband bill. Why is this type of program so important now, and what kind of lifeline could it provide?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, it's incredibly important because of the price. I talked about how prices have gone up for broadband pretty much across the board, and especially at the lower end of the tiers that are offered. But wherever they're going, we all know that Lifeline, as Mr. Shelton discussed, is incredibly important. It's only $9.25 a month, and it basically gets people a free phone with limited data. So getting more money into their hands so they can get plans that are available from ISPs today off the shelf at a much higher speed or a much more robust package is just crucial to getting people connected and keeping them that way.
Yeah, are you concerned about objections raised by some that this program that we just marked up in full committee could target some of the same households?
No, I wouldn't say I'm concerned. I mean, obviously, the new FCC can take account of that and maybe try to look for ways to be efficient and look for duplication. But even if there is some duplication, I wouldn't say I was concerned by it because we all know that kids need connectivity at home. And if the kid has connectivity, that's great for the student, but the parents need internet too. So if a parent gets a device or has some broadband capability to conduct their own work, look for jobs, do telehealth visits, everything else that's part of our virtual lives right now, I certainly wouldn't think that's bad. Most of us take that for granted, in fact, and that's something that many households would benefit from who don't have it today.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, as you know, many folks are eager for schools to safely reopen for in-person instruction. And as an educator and superintendent, you're responsible for facilitating that transition. Do you believe, as many of us do, that the additional funding for remote learning, like the $7.6 billion this committee passed last week, will help schools safely reopen sooner? We have some of our colleagues that are arguing rather strongly that the funding for distance learning would actually slow down the reopening process. What do you believe?
Absolutely not. First of all, in Topeka Public Schools, we actually reopened at the beginning of the year K through 12. So we had in-person learning in small groups, and that's for over 13,000 students. As that virus spread, we did go back to remote learning. I will tell you that schools across the country, if you have that added service for remote learning, that's not going to slow down opening, because as I said in the beginning, prior to the pandemic, we needed these services. Virtual schools were already in place. Telehealth has already been in place. In many ways, it's just a light being shined on it. I think I believe, would further open schools more quickly if we have the flexibility to address the current pressing needs from the pandemic, but we also have the flexibility to continue to address the needs that were already existing prior to the pandemic occurring. So I certainly don't think additional funding would slow down by any measure the reopening. And many schools, particularly in rural America, have been opened throughout this pandemic, perhaps because of the small size. Again, in Topeka, we're not quite rural, but we were open as well. And all of our neighbors have been open as well in Shawnee County for most of their school districts, certainly throughout elementary.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Mr. Shelton, tell me, why do you believe that legislation like H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which would invest $100 billion in broadband deployment and adoption, will succeed in closing the digital divide, where deregulation and consolidation have really failed to result in service getting deployed to my colleagues' constituents in rural communities, or in lowering the cost of service for folks who are already struggling to pay their bills? You need to unmute, Chris.
The only way to improve broadband deployment is getting the companies that know how to do it to move forward. And the only way that's going to happen is with federal money used to help these companies get this done. And, it's obvious that deregulation, which has been going on for years now, is not doing the trick, because if it was, we wouldn't be having this meeting today. There's been so much deregulation that these companies get away with abandoning their copper and not replacing it with any, as that fella in California proves when he put a $10,000 ad in the Wall Street Journal. All of a sudden, he had broadband put in about 3 days later.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Shelton. I see my time is just about up, so I will yield back. And I will recognize my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. And again, I appreciate you holding the hearing today. I'd like to start my questions, before I start my question today, just correcting some of the facts that were listed in Mr. Shelton's opening statement that he made. First, it's really essential that we have all the correct facts as we go forward, but it's important that we know first that the $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit was a bipartisan priority that was included in the funding package at the end of the 2020 to respond to the pandemic. And second, the Office of Connectivity and Growth, which are called for in the statement, was also codified in that same bipartisan legislation. And we all are here because we want to close that digital divide, and we really want to work to make sure, and working with our colleagues across the aisle, that we are working in a bipartisan way. And I greatly appreciate the work that we've done in the past on this subcommittee. My first question is for Mr. Adelson. Again, thank you for your testimony. And one of the reasons our networks have performed so well during the pandemic is because our country's light touch regulatory approach enabled providers to have the necessary flexibility to respond quickly to the increased traffic. It helped providers step up voluntarily to expand low-income programs, open up our Wi-Fi hotspots, and provide needed relief to many Americans. Yesterday, I introduced the Wireless Leadership Act, which would require state and local governments to provide timely responses to applications to deploy wireless infrastructure, which will help the U.S. lead in 5G and improve connectivity for Americans. How will my bill and the other 27 permitting bills that we were introduced by ENC Republicans yesterday help responsibly roll back regulations and ensure our country's broadband networks can continue to handle more internet traffic?
Well, Congressman Latta, we're very grateful for the package of bills that you introduced. They really are full of thoughtful ideas. I'm especially appreciative of the fact that they will promote public safety in the deployment of, we're talking about the pandemic and how essential it is to have service. And people say, well, we want backup generators, we want backup power, but then they don't let us site a generator or they make it difficult. Well, this is going to make it easier to put in emergency power. It'll make it easier to put in FirstNet for public safety, which people rely on. And frankly, it makes it easier to put in equipment of all kinds that could benefit people that are having health emergencies, that are working from home. We need to get infrastructure in place in order to do it, and we need to do it responsibly. I think what I love about the bill is that it focuses on co-location. This should be the low-hanging fruit. We're talking about siting on existing infrastructure. It shouldn't be that controversial to swap out equipment that's on an existing infrastructure, to upgrade to 5G. Now we need to work together. Municipalities are our partners. We've worked with them on these things, and many municipalities are doing a great job of rolling out the red carpet. And I have to say, the pandemic, they realized, please invest. We need your investment to do it. And they made it, they've bent over backwards during the pandemic to help us make sure that we can continue the process, get emergency equipment in place to deal with bottlenecks that affected that. But we need smart policies to build out 5G and close the digital divide. We're going to contribute 1.5 trillion of the U.S. GDP through 5G, 4.5 million jobs in virtually every sector. And if this committee is talking about investing large amounts, it makes sense to think about how do you co-locate that equipment on where there's already wireless equipment. How do you streamline the process? Shot clocks, federal lands, a lot of good ideas we can sift through together. Look forward to working with you on them.
Well, thank you very much. Let me follow up with this. It's really interesting, the information you gave on how much money that we're looking at 5G is going to have out there in the economy, and also with the number of jobs. But do you have any information on how much money and time carriers spend on complying to all the regulations necessary to deploy broadband in both our cities and rural communities?
Because that information is so dispersed and we don't actually gather it. Every time there's a delay in getting something cited, workers aren't working to put that in place. People are paying for time that's not being used, or leases that could have been started earlier. It's almost impossible to quantify. I think what we can quantify is the benefit to the economy. If we're talking about basically one in six Americans are affected by this industry. We have such a dramatic impact on the economy that it's just essential that we get that done quickly. And it's not just our industry that it costs money for. When it's delayed, it costs everybody. Talking about the homework gap and equipment that serves them. We're so grateful for the committee's work to try to address that. Of course, the industry helped so many families at home. We want to help every family, and many were left behind, but so many were able to benefit, as Matt talked about with his family. We need to bring those benefits to everybody and do it quickly, and private investment largely drives that. We need help, I think, as well from public investment, but if we're going to do that, having the most efficient means to deploy and reasonable. We don't need to deal with just steamrolling municipalities, but there's certain reasonable limits we should have. Shot clocks, let's expedite it, let's get it done.
Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back, and I'll submit my other question for the record. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. And now the chair recognizes Mr. Pallone, the full committee chairman, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I want to thank all the witnesses. I'm going to try to get 3 quick questions in here, hopefully with some quick responses, although each of them could take an hour to respond to. So last month, this was from Mr. Shelton. Last month, I sent a bunch of letters to internet service providers cautioning them against raising prices, instituting data caps during the pandemic. And, you know, this has been an issue in my district where one provider instituted some large increases just before the pandemic, and other ISPs have tried to institute data caps during the pandemic. Luckily, at least some of the major ISPs have decided to temporarily lift these data caps following our congressional oversight, but caps remain in some areas, and it's questionable at any time, but particularly during the pandemic, when so many people, had to be online. So, Mr. Sheldon, can you talk about why, in your view, data caps are problematic, both for consumers and for labor, especially during the COVID pandemic? If you could spend about a minute responding to that, I'd appreciate it. I think he's muted.
The pandemic has really forced millions of working families to use far more data than they would normally be using, and to put data caps on them to make them pay more money would just make this problem worse. Anybody or any company putting in data caps now and charging more for people that go over data caps is just exacerbating an already terrible situation.
Thank you, Mr. Sheldon. Now, Mr. Wood, as you know, under the emergency broadband benefit, which I mentioned earlier that we put in the end of the year package, the FCC is going to be working with participating providers to fund a $50 discount on struggling families on their broadband bills, or $75 for families on tribal lands. I know we'd like this program to be perfect, but it needs to be implemented. But that said, I do hope that we can create a long-term solution, because this is short-term, a long-term solution that all Americans can afford and take advantage of services necessary. So what are some of the principles we should look to in formulating a long-term solution to the affordability issue? And is gathering and distributing better broadband pricing data a factor in that, in your view? In about a minute to respond.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, there's a lot there, but yes, better data is crucial, and we need to know what we're addressing before we try to launch into it. We need to have more funding. I think it's about as plain and simple as that. As I said, it needs to be progressive and not a regressive tax, frankly, on people who already have trouble affording the service. And it needs to be sustainable over the long haul. So many members here have worked on the Lifeline program for so many years, and it's wonderful. It's necessary, but it's only $9.25 a month, and it's about 26% participation rate at the end of 2020, even with the pandemic putting so much economic pressure on people. So we just need to get more money into the system, although we also need to account for the prices. We can't just forever subsidize rising retail rates without any attempt to lower those costs through competition and more choices and other measures that would help to bring prices down, even as subsidies go up.
All right, thank you. And then lastly, Dr. Anderson, our committee just approved a reconciliation measure that will provide $7.6 billion for emergency connectivity and end user devices to connect teachers and students. And I know some like to think of it as funding for hotspots, but actually it includes in-home broadband and other technological solutions. And some of my colleagues have said that money from the CARES Act is more than enough to solve this digital divide, and that, we don't need more funding. Of course, I hear the opposite. So with that, Dr. Anderson, how much has the Topeka School District received from federal COVID relief funding? What kinds of expenses have you covered with this funding? And how are you using it to resolve the homework gap? And, would you say that the digital divide in your district is now resolved, or do we need to do more? And you have a minute or less.
All right, a minute or less. Well, then I'll speak really fast and pretty broadly over much of that. Let me start off with that funding overall. I know that's the area that's probably the hottest spot that you really want to talk about. Do know that funding for us, and I'll just kind of speak pretty broadly, in terms of the CARES Act and those ESSER funds, for us, we have a little bit over $3 million, and 40% went to nutrition programs, 20% to transportation. We had 22% that went to PPE equipment, then another percentage that went to disinfecting items. So the CARES Act can't take care of all of broadband and connectivity issues, is my point in that regard. Certainly, we need to continue to do more. We need to make sure that we provide the level of services and resources for families to be able to connect at home. Hey, let me give you an example. We have parent conferences tonight. I bet you're wondering how. Well, through internet services at home that parents are doing with us. We have families right now that are still quarantined. We have families right now that are still addressing medically sensitive students that can't come back because they have some level of disease or cancer or whatever the items are that won't allow them to come back, even if we reopen right now because they're medically fragile. Those individuals are relying on us services, and they certainly deserve them. That's kind of a broad brush. So we certainly need the investment. CARES Act can't do it all. We need this additional money for remote and learning services.
Gentlemen, okay, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Scalise. Is Steve there? Steve, you need to unmute if you're there. If not, let's move down to Mr. Guthrie. We'll come back to Steve if he's here.
Thanks,
Mr.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it very much. Mr. Adelstein, I understand there may be some carriers that have Huawei or ZTE in their networks that anticipate having difficulty ripping and replacing that equipment within the timeline laid out by the Secure and Trusted Networking Act because of delays on obtaining the necessary permits. Even though Congress just appropriated $1.9 billion to carry out this bipartisan reimbursement program, is there anything we can do to help providers meet this national security imperative?
I believe there's a piece of legislation introduced in your package that addresses this, that would expedite permitting for rip and replace. You want to get that done quickly as a national security issue. Getting that equipment out of our networks is an essential step, and we very much appreciate Congress providing the funding to make that happen and to make the carriers whole for that.
Okay, thank you. And then also, Mr. Adelstein, the China task force led last year by House Republicans identified broadband permitting as an important way to help speed broadband deployment domestically, which in turn helps support trusted suppliers, speak back Huawei. How important is the speed to achieving scale and infrastructure deployment to supporting trusted suppliers and the deployment of Open RAN technologies?
Well, that's a part of the solution. I mean, there's a lot of things we need to do to keep up with China. They don't play fair. They steal our IP. They have a command economy. What we have to watch out for is we have a command economy. A stop clock is right twice a year. And they picked 5G. I think they picked the right thing in this case to just shove it down the throats of their people. So in permitting, there's no problem. If they need equipment, there's no problem. If they need a workforce that can build out these networks, you think they have trouble recruiting people or training them? No, they say you will go and work in this industry, and we're going to train you and be set. So we're not playing with the same hand. We're expecting the private sector. We will do it, and we're not asking for command economy. We're not asking for anything but a helping hand in partnership with the government, which we've seen in spectrum policy. We've seen an infrastructure policy. We've made a lot of progress, and we'd love to see what we do together on workforce development as well.
Okay, I had a third question for you, Mr. Adelstein, and you led right into it. And so I just want to say, my focus, I was on ed and workforce before I, as a waiver to be on ed and workforce before now, I'm just on energy and commerce this time. But it's always been, I've always enjoyed that committee because I wanted to make sure people just didn't have access to a job. They had access to a career that paid well, where they could raise their family, and in a way that we all want people to have the quality of life. And it all comes from having the skills. I mean, showing up with the skills that people are willing to pay for. And there is demand for those skills in your area and what we're talking about. Matter of fact, it'll be hard to close the digital divide by deploying the necessary infrastructure without people with the skills. Could you talk about what your association is doing about workforce in this area, and hopefully highlight to anybody listening the quality of career that you're offering people?
Yeah, these are great jobs, as Mr. Shelton knows. These are high-paying jobs, and it's a growing industry, and we need a workforce pipeline to make sure we have skilled workers coming into it. So we created an organization that brought apprenticeships into the wireless industry for the first time, called telecommunications industry registered apprenticeship program because it's perfect for apprenticeships. You know, this program is taken off. We have 2,000 apprentices. We have 50 employers that have signed up to do it. Secretary of Labor, in his confirmation hearing, Secretary Welsh lauded what we're doing at WIA. We're partnering with the Power and Communications Contractors Association. We also are working with technical students, with community colleges in states across the country, including one in Kentucky, Somerset, that is to help us build this out. And we'd like to work with HBCUs, with tribal colleges, because the academic world hasn't kept pace with us. So we're teaching schools how to help our industry basically develop the skills, because you know you can't go to schools and learn field tech work. I mean, apprenticeships people do it on the ground. We want schools feeding people into apprenticeships. They can get good jobs with our companies. They can get jobs with CWA. But why not get them the best skills possible? So if the federal government is making an investment in infrastructure, that investment can be spent efficiently with people that know what they're doing. The people we can diversify the workforce. We can bring in people that were hit hard by the pandemic and give them good, high-paying jobs, start them in apprenticeships, and they'll have a career pathway that will last for many years to come and lead to very high-wage jobs they can support their families with.
Okay, thanks. Well, I was going to have Mr. Shelton talk about that as well, but I only have about 5 seconds left. So hopefully you can touch on that in some other testimonies as we move forward. So I'm now out of time. I'm sorry. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for the great hearing, and I thank the witnesses for coming out on a cold day today. Mr. Wood, I want to make sure that everyone who is eligible to participate in the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program can easily do so. In California, the state has a program to help low-income individuals pay their utility bills. This is a self-certification process for initial enrollment. 95% of eligible households participate in the program. This is much higher than participation in the Lifeline program. Mr. Wood, why would it be important that we minimize the burden for eligible households to enroll in the emergency broadband program?
Well, I think as you said, Congressman, it's crucial to get everybody connected and online, and we can't really tolerate the low participation levels we've seen with Lifeline. You mentioned self-certification or some kind of after-the-fact documentation, and it's great to hear about the successes in California. I know that in the current FCC proceeding to implement the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, some internet service providers have suggested that, so have some public interest groups. I think it would obviously depend on how that is done, but anything we can do to lower the barriers and especially to increase outreach, I think those are the two keys to make sure that people can get into the program and they know about it in the first place, and that's what will make it a success.
Well, thank you. I'm concerned that during and prior to the pandemic, there's been a real lack of transparency with respect to the information disclosed by providers to consumers and the Federal Communication Commission. Mr. Wood, if we don't have full transparency from providers about their offerings, including pricing and detailed reporting about participation, they're saying in their EBB program, what risks could this pose for the program's success?
Yes, definitely. We were so glad to see the letters that you sent along with both chairmen to the companies to ask about their practices and policies, both in pandemic and afterwards. We generally need more transparency about what they're doing. I laugh sometimes when ISPs say the market's really competitive, and we say, well, what are your prices? And they, well, we can't tell you.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a trust and verify that we would like to see. But also in the pandemic and for this program, we need to make sure that A, people are getting the best deal they can with this large and flexible benefit, and that providers are not doing anything like raising their rates artificially so they can get more subsidy out of taxpayers' dollars. So that's why transparency in the program is important, both for the individuals, but also for the program as a whole and for the country.
Right. Well, in your testimony, you noted that prices have been increasing for internet service. As you know, I've expressed concerns that some providers have been doing this during the pandemic. Can you discuss how the price increases have correlated with capital investments by these providers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be clear. Investment by these companies is always high. It's just not consistent enough. As many members will attest, it's not getting into rural areas quick enough. But it hasn't taken the path that some have suggested. In fact, it's gone down over the last few years because regulations don't actually drive much of the investment. It's actually competition and, most importantly, most likely, the technology evolution and the cycles that they go through. So many wired providers, especially, are on a downward path and have been for the last 4 years. And that's why we said deregulation alone, without consideration of these economic factors, is not going to put us back in a better direction and really get everybody connected.
Well, very good, very good. You would think that with all the talk today by our Republican colleagues about streamlining, that it's a silver bullet to bringing broadband to everyone in the country. Unfortunately, I'm not at all convinced, especially after the Trump FCC spent 4 years prioritizing deregulation and made little, if any, progress toward narrowing the digital divide. Mr. Wood, would deregulating the infrastructure siting process lead to increase in broadband access and affordability for families living in unserved and underserved areas?
No, Congressman, I don't think meaningfully so. Now, obviously, that matters. Streamlining and shot clocks, like Commissioner Adelstein is talking about, those are a fine idea, and we would be happy to consider how those work and the interplay between cities and providers. But as I said, deregulation alone is not enough, and we need to also have policies that increase competition and that provide people support, because the price is too high right now, and we need to make sure that people have more options from the whole suite. They're not just forced into the cheapest plan they can get, or the low income plan, as helpful as those may be for some people.
Excellent. Well, I want to emphasize that we must do everything possible to ensure that the most vulnerable are connected. In my district, many individuals living in public housing do not have broadband service. That's why I'm currently working on legislation to improve broadband in public housing. And I will also be reintroducing the Digital Equity Act. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, all the witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I don't see Mr. Kinzinger, so I'm going to go to my fellow suffering Pittsburgh Pirate fan, Gus Bilirakis. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we did sign a pretty good pitcher last night, so I can still retain my position in Congress, which is a good thing. I don't think I do very well. Before I get to my questions, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I want to take an opportunity to acknowledge the hard work that the telecommunications industry has done throughout this pandemic. Programmers committed to $100 million to facilitate distance learning for children, and are now engaging in the development of tools to help spread accurate information for vaccines and how one gets an appointment. I know this is a tough task, but I want to commend them for doing that. Additionally, providers stepped up with billions of capital investment to offer low-cost services to those financially strained by COVID-19, and free broadband to students and teachers for nearly a year to do their part in helping the next generation achieve success. And lastly, I have to thank the essential on-the-ground technicians who literally have kept us all connected as they enter homes and businesses to maintain the sense of normalcy that is our internet services. So again, I want to thank them. Sometimes they don't get the thank you that they deserve, and I know we have to do much more, Mr. Chairman, but we can build on their successes. As part of the, this is my question, as part of the boosting broadband connectivity rollout, I reintroduced the Coastal Broadband Deployment Act. In short, this legislation would codify an FCC action that reduces red tape for broadband projects in a floodplain where the applicant has met certain safety standards. Mr. Adelstein, can you explain the importance of codifying regulatory action from the perspective of business development and investment? Please,
Well,
go ahead.
first of all, I believe the bill makes it so that floodplains are not subject to NEPA. NIPA, it's an important area to review. It's something that I'd like to look at closely with my members and provide any assistance I can. We certainly appreciate the effort. I'm familiar with the issues you face in Florida with regard to this. I mean, we need to make sure that we get broadband where it needs to be. Sometimes these difficult to reach areas need a little bit of help, and we need to get that out there quickly, efficiently, and we will work with you on your legislation. We'll get back to you on the details. I was just reviewing it late last night, so I don't have a lot to offer right now, but I pledge to work with you on that and supply any further thoughts for the record.
Yeah, and I believe it's a bipartisan piece of legislation too, so, but I think it's crucial. The second question, it's personal. In recent weeks, national attention has been drawn to the city of Oldsmar in my district. And by the way, that's the founder of Oldsmar is R.E. Olds from Ohio, actually, but he had a business in Michigan, but he founded Oldsmar in Florida, and he is the inventor of the Oldsmobile. So every year we have an Oldsmobile parade. That was a great car. They should bring it back. Folks, the city's water treatment facility was the subject of a cyber attack where a hacker breached our critical infrastructure systems and attempted to increase water treatment chemicals to fatal levels. I'm sure you've heard this. The breach was immediately discovered and neutralized. The infrastructure liability was strengthened and the public was never at risk. The incident is currently under federal investigation and the hacker remains at large, but preliminary reports show that a lack of infrastructure upgrades are a contributing factor. For our jurisdiction, I think this highlights the importance of making it as easy as possible to create and enhance our telecommunications infrastructure. Again, for Mr. Adelstein, do you believe that reducing regulatory burdens would quicken infrastructure development to meaningfully reduce the chances of breaches like the one that we've seen in our district? And again, folks, I would recommend you check with your cities because this could have been devastating if this guy was successful in hacking this particular program. So, but sir, could you answer that question? I would appreciate it. Thank you.
I had heard about that incident, and 5G.
Please be brief with your answer as your time has expired, but go ahead and finish, Mr. Adelstein.
Just real quick, 5G presents great opportunities to improve network security, and so we need to build out 5G. My industry is committed to spending $275 billion to do it. We need to also educate cybersecurity professionals that are specifically trained in 5G because there are unique characteristics and technical details. 5G is not your father's Oldsmobile, so to speak, and but it does create some great opportunities to increase network security. But we need to maximize them by also investing in the human capital to make sure we can program those networks to protect against attacks like those.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Expired.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Latta, for convening this timely hearing today. I'd first like to applaud the Energy and Commerce Committee for passing our bold proposals out of committee last week, which included $7.6 billion to ensure students and their teachers had access to the internet. This was a much needed step to help rescue the American people. Since the start of the pandemic, I've repeatedly stated the exacerbating inequities COVID-19 has displayed in low-income communities and communities of color. These inequities span from public health disparities to economic pressures that are compounded in our most vulnerable communities. But today, we must discuss the access and affordability of issues of broadband. Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, director of the Brookings Center for Technology Innovation, stated, "We're running up against a roadblock of digital access, and in particular, digital access for disproportionately low-income, people of color, older Americans, and those in rural areas." I wholeheartedly agree with Dr. Lee and go further to add that urban America faces unique challenges in this conversation. I do recognize that there have been good faith efforts to address the digital divide inflamed by this pandemic. Longer standing programs like Lifeline that help provide affordable service for qualifying low-income consumers should be protected and maintained. And newer programs like temporary EBB program should continue to thrive and provide connectivity support for those in need. There have been more good faith efforts like the donation of connected devices to families who need them, but this is a Band-Aid solution to a much larger access and affordability issue. More can be and needs to be done to undergird vulnerable communities. So my first question is to Matt Wood. Mr. Wood, in your testimony, you stated that broadband is an essential utility for learning and livelihoods, and I couldn't agree more. Could you expound on the statement and weigh in on how agencies like the FCC could further protect this essential utility by going further than efforts brought forth by former Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge?
Certainly, Representative Clark, thank you for the question. I think it's just beyond doubt at this point that this is an essential utility. Anybody who wants to say otherwise, I think, is running up against the facts and will not be get a lot of heads nodding to agree with them, because people need it now and during the pandemic and before it as well, and certainly well after too. The problem with the pledge, we thought it wasn't a bad thing in a vacuum, but it was basically a request to the internet service providers not to cut people off for non-payment during the pandemic. And the FCC could and should be able to require that, not simply ask companies to provide just and reasonable service during a pandemic, but to say, hey, this is a special situation. You can't do that now. You can't throw people off just because of the economic downturn they're facing. So that's the kind of thing that we think a revived FCC could do, take a little more serious role in requiring that service be available, not just asking that it be made available.
Very well. And Mr. Shelton, would you, is there something that you would like to add? Okay. My next question is to Dr. Tiffany Anderson. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you explained that there are additional E-rate expansions necessary to ensure that E-rate is meeting the 21st century needs of both rural and urban students and families during and beyond the pandemic. What would the program we just funded in the committee's $7.6 billion appropriated through the E-rate authorities in the Communications Act mean for school systems nationwide desperate for much needed tools and resources for equitable educational opportunity?
First of all, thank you so much for that question, Representative Clark. It means a great deal. It gives us flexibility. The less flexibility you have as a school system, the less that you can really serve the needs of all the most vulnerable. You know, as examples, as you talked about all that happened last week and the approval of being able to provide eligible equipment, you know, hotspots and modems and all of those things, internet services in homes, and being able to extend those services just allows us to reach beyond where we currently are. You talked about urban school districts, and so we're talking about districts that have everything from a transiency population and a mobility rate that's very high to a homeless population that's very high. Here's what we can do even right now, this new access and this proposal, we actually will be able to take E-rate and really meet families where they are. How beautiful is that? Which means if you are someone that's moving from house to house, we can give you a phone as opposed to giving you a hotspot for that space. If you're someone that has a need for a Cox and you have a stable place to live, and we can provide you that. So flexibility, Representative Clark, is what it allows us, what it will allow us to do on the proposal, what's been passed. And certainly the expanded E-rate, the more that you can expand that level of flexibility of meeting families where they are, the more you help families move out of poverty.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic did not create the urban-rural digital divide, but it has certainly exposed and highlighted it. Students on the wrong side of this digital divide can't attend virtual classes, and workers aren't able to work remotely at their jobs. The divide is creating winners and losers in our country right now. In a nation as prosperous and innovative as ours, this lack of access here in the 21st century, when virtually everything is dependent on the digital economy, is more than unfair. It's immoral. It's wrong. The lack of broadband in rural America is not a new problem. It's one that has been talked about for decades. Furthermore, While I acknowledge that affordability may play a factor in the availability of broadband for some in urban and rural locations, the lack of infrastructure and accessibility in rural America means that broadband simply is not an option, period. That's especially true in many of the places I represent. You can't pay for a service that doesn't exist. You don't even have the option. And while I wholeheartedly agree that the digital divide is an issue we must address, I'm disappointed that this hearing on Connecting America pays little attention to the primary reason why those residing in rural America are left behind. The reason is because access, the infrastructure, is simply not available. I was pleased to join my Republican colleagues in introducing legislation earlier this week to boost broadband connectivity. My bill, H.R. 1056, the Wireless Broadband Competition and Efficient Deployment Act, would be a step in the right direction. It would remove the requirement to prepare an environmental or historic preservation review in order to add new or upgrade wireless facilities on existing infrastructure. These burdensome reviews that are often repetitive unnecessarily slow down broadband expansion. So I'm pleased to introduce this common sense legislation to help streamline the process. Lastly, I acknowledge and commend the many internet service providers who have stepped up to the connectivity challenge during this pandemic, including those who voluntarily committed to Chairman Pai's Keep America Connected pledge to ensure Americans would not lose their broadband or telephone service despite financial constraints stemming from COVID-19. I'm also aware that several ISPs are offering reduced rates or even free broadband access for low-income families, particularly for students who otherwise couldn't afford to connect to their virtual classrooms. Broadband has proven to be a necessity regardless of where you live, and the continued investments into broadband, creative solutions, and flexibility of ISPs to provide reliable broadband access wherever possible is important. So, Mr. Adelstein, can you talk about how helping providers quickly upgrade existing infrastructure and reduce the environmental footprint of networks would help lower consumer prices? Is facilitating competition and consumer choice a good thing for low-income consumers?
Absolutely. I think competition is critical, and the way you get competition is putting more equipment up more quickly. And so, your bill, for example, would exempt co-location from NEPA and NIPA, would, as I read it, codify the National Programmatic Agreement that was arrived at on a bipartisan basis. This is, the common sense. We're talking about co-locations here. Again, on existing equipment, why shouldn't we be able to invest more? Why should we be held up for a year on a NIPA or NEPA review, spending time and money when that can be facilitated by legislation like yours, or by the good work that the FCC did to amend the programmatic agreement under leadership of Commissioner Carr. So there is really a lot to be said for this kind of work. We work in partnership with municipalities, but this kind of approach is important to facilitate. I mean, the kind of investment we're making, a record in the last 4 years, $29 billion in wireless infrastructure investments in 2019. These are unparalleled. And that's why we have what we have.
Well, good. Well, hey, 5G promises to help us realize higher broadband speeds across the nation, especially for people that live in the most rural parts of our country. In practice, however, promised speeds won't be realized without a significant investment in backhaul. As you know, there's a significant shortage of trained telecommunication workers to build out these 5G fiber networks. So do you believe Congress should both support the workforce needs of 5G and fiber network deployments?
Absolutely. Fiber and 5G fit together hand in glove. They're all part of the network. Every 5G antenna has to have fiber, and we need more people trained to do this. There are a lot of good workers out there that do it today, but we can reskill workers, we can diversify the workforce. And this is a traditional area where government works with the private sector. We're willing to lead, develop apprenticeship programs. We'd like some support for training to expedite it. And the reason is our industry is critical for the entire economy. Virtually every industry in the country is going to rely on 5G networks. And so we need those technicians to boost jobs, not just in our industry, but throughout the economy. 4.5 million jobs in virtually every sector. So I applaud your efforts, and I think we can work together on that.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Chair, let's see, I don't see Mr. Oh, I do. Okay, Mr. Vesey, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the witnesses today to come and talk about, again, this emergency broadband benefit. Again, this is a program that can be very instrumental in keeping vulnerable communities connected during the time that we're in right now, especially the time that we're going through right now in Texas. Right now, our goal should be to help make the process of accessing this benefit as easy as possible for consumers. People are dealing with a lot right now. Things are very difficult. And again, we want to try to make life as easy for these vulnerable communities as we possibly can during this time period, because now things, especially here, have just been compounded. According to a January 2021 GAO report on how the FCC has implemented the Lifeline National Verifier program, we know that many eligible people will abandon their applications when they can't successfully navigate the system or it's too cumbersome. I don't want this happening in the emergency broadband benefit program. I have a lot of confidence that the new chairwoman of the FCC is going to be thoughtful about this program. And I know that they had a great roundtable put together last week so that they can build on that. Mr. Wood, what else should the FCC be thinking about to make sure it's as easy as possible for people and families who qualify to access the emergency broadband benefit?
Thank you, Congressman Vesey, and thank you for your leadership on that bill that was passed by the House first last May and then finally was passed by the Senate as well at the end of the year. We definitely need low barriers to application and verification. And as you said, there are some concerns about that, even though we think that there are ways to speed that up. And hopefully, most people that go through the automated process have a relatively quick and accurate eligibility determination. But what you're talking about is people who have to provide additional documentation. Sometimes they can't do it. If you're not online, it's very hard to upload something online to prove that you should be able to get online. So we have to think about those barriers and make sure that the process is both centralized and localized, I would say. The FCC should be collecting a lot of data and making information available to people, but then we also need local supports and community organizers, local governments, digital inclusion specialists to aid people in that application process so that nobody falls through the cracks.
Right, exactly, and that I think that's so key for a lot of these communities. I think that we saw that, even with COVID-19, with some of the business assistance programs like PPP, some of these smaller businesses being able to access things when they're poor, working day to day is much more difficult, and you can make the process more cumbersome. Following up on that, we need to make sure that we have robust provider participation in this program. The more providers that participate, the farther this program can reach consumers all across the nation. What are some things that we in Congress or the FCC should consider to ensure there's a high participation, that there is high participation on the provider side?
Yes, thank you. I think you've already done a lot of the work there. The flexibility to us at Free Press Action was a key part of this bill, and that's thanks to your leadership and the committee staff as well, and Chairman Doyle's staff, because we wanted to get people as much aid as we could as quickly as possible for the plans available to them today. So rather than have people either shunted into low income plans that might not meet their needs, or the opposite extreme, forced to pay more than they can afford, even if they get some discount off of that, we thought those would both be bad outcomes. And so giving people the flexibility to pick which plan they want should be good, not only for the individuals, but also for the ISPs who can take that discount and get that reimbursement for basically any plan they offer.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Let's see. I think next is Mark Wayne Mullen. Mark, are you here? Mark Wayne, you need to unmute if you're here. Okay, what about, let's try Mr. Rollberg, are you here? Well, I see Billy Long there. So, Billy, I'm going to recognize you because you're the only one I can see on my screen so far. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I had a snowmageddon here today. We had 13 below yesterday, and so I was late for the gavel, but I appreciate you letting me in. Took the daughter over to run her rounds at the hospital today, and battery died and all that good stuff, but I am here, so I'll join in. Mr. Adelstein, President Biden told senators last week that he wants Congress to move fast on a big infrastructure plan to keep up with China. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to reduce the barriers to deployment so public and private investment can be deployed as quickly as possible to connect more Americans. How important are these streamlining reforms to winning the technological race to 5G with China?
Well, it's essential to winning the race to 5G. I mean, as I said, they are basically using government fiat to try to shove it through and try to win on a global basis by stealing IP, by using inappropriate means, and by just shoveling it down the throats of people as they do so many things in China. The United States has the private sector leading, and we talked today about the need to fill some gaps. I think it's a great opportunity for bipartisan agreement for rural broadband. I used to work, Louisiana, across the country on at the Rural Utility Service to get broadband out to rural America, and working with you in this committee to find the resources on a bipartisan basis to get that done in an infrastructure bill would be most welcome. And, that requires many different steps. If you're going to do that efficiently, you need to have, the processes to get that infrastructure in place efficiently. You need the people trained to build it efficiently and safely. You need to have really a public-private partnership with educational institutions, with the companies that are going to invest, because primarily this is going to be driven by private investment. We spent $30 billion a year investing in wireless networks, and much more if you combine it with wireline networks. That's what's delivered the greatest network in the world here in the United States that responded to this pandemic in an unparalleled fashion. So I think all of these elements are necessary to beat China in the race to 5G and create 4.5 million jobs in virtually every sector of the economy.
I'm kind of like my buddy Bill Johnson, and we called each other to see how to dress today. And but I have a lot of rural area just like he does, and I've been on this 5G and rural broadband hunt for a long time. So I appreciate anything we can do to. I don't think a student should be limited. Their internet access shouldn't be limited by geography. They shouldn't have to go over to Starbucks or drive up 20 miles to McDonald's or wherever to get a signal. And so I appreciate all of that. Also, I'd like to point out that in a recent report shows that investment in 5G will result in the creation of 4.5 million jobs and contribute $1.5 trillion to the gross domestic product from 2020 to 2030. So doing this sooner rather than later matters quite a little bit. Also, Mr. Adelstein, Chairman Pai's Keep Americans Connected pledge asked internet providers to take many actions before Congress could pass the large-scale relief that we got through last year. On top of the essential aspects of the pledge, such as keeping the internet on regardless of payment, waiving late fees, overage fees, and data caps, many companies went above and beyond by opening their Wi-Fi hotspots to the public for anyone to use and work closely with schools, libraries, and hospitals to ensure connection. How important was the light touch regulatory approach in this place as a result of longstanding bipartisan policies facilitating this industry-led response?
Well, light touch regulatory approaches led to the world's greatest broadband networks, including our leadership in 4G, which we need to maintain 4G. And it was, a sacrifice for everybody. The pledge, no terminations, the inability to pay. We waived late fees. We opened millions of Wi-Fi hotspots to those in need. And the industry worked overtime to try to address this, realizing that it was a lifeline for people. So, you're exactly right. And to answer your other question even further, as we're thinking about a broad infrastructure package, you want to make that as efficient as possible so you can stretch taxpayer dollars. I mean, you can encourage co-location on existing infrastructure as your legislation does. You can make sure it's technology neutral so that wireless as well as wireline solutions are eligible. If you allow for OpEx as well as CapEx, that also helps stretch taxpayer dollars.
I appreciate it. And I would like to add right here at the end that with a daughter that's a pediatrician, and she's been staying at our house the last few days, so Dad could drive her in the snow to get to work and get to the hospital to make her rounds to see the new babies. Her phone started ringing early this morning. All of her nurses and everyone could not get to work. And so now she is doing all her visits over the internet today. So that just to prove the point how important all this is. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for letting me in. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes, let's see, I don't see Dawn. Darren Soto. Darren, are you there? Darren, you need to unmute if you're here. Okay, let's try Mr. O'Halloran. Is Mr. O'Halloran here? Okay, let's go to Ms. Rice.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wood, as you pointed out in your testimony, this pandemic has exacerbated the adoption gap. That is people who have access to broadband but can't afford to purchase it, or in some instances choose not to adopt it. In my district, this adoption gap has resulted in students having extremely different outcomes with at-home learning who live just blocks away from one another, because one student can get online while the other can't. Now, this could be because they simply don't have access, or because the whole family is utilizing one hotspot. So can you just expound a little more on how the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program could help close this adoption gap? Because once these kids get behind, it's very, very difficult for them to catch up.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. I think that's the key, is that it's really about the whole household. So a lot of the E-rate program, rightly and crucially, is aimed at connecting students, but of course they are part of family situations. And if the family isn't connected, then the student can't get online. I think, luckily for many of us, we couldn't imagine having to share a single device for an entire family. And that's why, as I said earlier, we have to think about efficiency. We can't have a ton of duplication in these programs, but frankly, I'm not concerned or worried that a student might have a device and their parent might be able to get online affordably and reliably for the first time in too long. So it really is, as you said, it's key to having the whole family be part of that educational system, as I'm sure Dr. Anderson could attest to.
Mr. Wood, I know that my colleague, Mr. Veazey, kind of touched on this. Do you agree that encouraging broad participation in this program by ISP providers will help maximize both consumer choice and increased enrollment? We've seen the problems with the Lifeline program, so trying to avoid that. Do you agree that encouraging broad participation would help maximize both consumer choice and increase enrollment?
Yes, definitely. And as I said, we were happy to see that kind of flexibility that I think will allow more ISPs to come in, not to say we're picking and choosing for them a particular plan. The Lifeline benefit is crucial. We should never discount it or say that it's not something we must preserve, but it is only $9.25 a month, and it tends to be a wireless plan only. So, 26% participation rate at the end of the pandemic, perhaps, for Lifeline, that's pretty low. And we think that is for a myriad of reasons, but one of them being some people will pay for the service even if they would qualify for Lifeline, because that Lifeline phone is just not enough to meet their needs, either as an individual or as a family.
So, Mr. Wood, we've talked about different communities that are more likely than others to lack broadband service at home, but one group that really hasn't received as much attention as older Americans. There was a report that was issued earlier this year that estimates that as many as 22 million older Americans lack home broadband service. There may be many reasons for this, including affordability and digital literacy, but this is so troubling, especially now as the pandemic has severely impacted older Americans. So lack of home broadband makes it harder to get critical health information, I can't tell you how many complaints I've gotten from constituents who said, I can't make an appointment to save my life to get a vaccine. To say nothing of, meeting the requirements for their telehealth services. So what more can we do to increase broadband adoption by older Americans? I mean, this is not just in my district. I'm sure every single one of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have older Americans in their as their constituents who are facing this problem.
Yes, it's definitely a problem. And I think that the numbers are probably moving in the right direction. As we've all gotten more used to the technology, more and more older people are online, and the percentages aren't quite as low as they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But it's not getting better fast enough, and especially in a pandemic, but really anytime. People need access to telehealth and all sorts of other things to conduct their lives and stay safe. So what we can do more, I think, is it's obviously about affordability and price. It's about access, as many members have talked about today as well. And it's about literacy as well, and making sure that people have the tools they need. The only reason I hesitate to say it's all about digital literacy is I do think we shouldn't stereotype. Many older Americans are very aware of the internet and what benefits it would bring to them. So we can't assume that people just don't realize what they're missing. I think it really is that unhealthy cocktail of factors of people not being able to afford it, not having good access, and then sometimes just not having the tools they need to really make use of it.
So, to your point, Mr. Wood, I have a 95-year-old aunt who is better using her iPad than I am. So point well taken. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses, and I yield back now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Now the chair moves to Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, are you here?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, guys, we've been talking about broadband for rural parts, and I just want to point out, I live it every day. I live in the middle of nowhere, and then you turn and you go another mile to get to my house. The nearest town to me is maybe a 15-minute drive. With weather like we're having today, it's a 30-minute drive. Where my kids go to school, it's a 30-minute drive. I'm on that last mile to which we talk about. And in less than 50%, literally less than 50% of my district has broadband coverage. And yet almost my entire district is out of school and have been out of school for a week, not because of COVID, because of the winter weather. I have 6 kids as we speak that's upstairs around our kitchen table, around our kitchen bar, that not a drinking bar, but one you eat at, that's doing their homework as we speak. And it wasn't until last year, December of last year, that our electric co-op actually brought us broadband down here. Until then, we used a hotspot, and a hotspot's not reliable. A hotspot is not something you can rely on, and not something you can do your work on. And especially if you're live streaming your classes, it's nearly impossible. But we have an issue. We have an issue in the rural parts of the country. We have an issue with our small internet providers, or ISPs, that are having to make a hard decision because we have companies like Netflix and Amazon that pays literally nothing to live stream their videos and to bring them that last mile. And especially the middle mile to us. And when you start dealing with this, when you're dealing about wireless or fixed wireless in rural parts of the country, I guess, Mr. Addleston, do you see a role that our rural broadband providers play in this? Because a lot of them are having to make a decision to either upgrade their system or get farther out there because they can't keep up the live stream demand from Netflix and Amazon that pays nothing to deliver their product to customers' homes, but yet customers pay for it.
I could agree with you more. I mean, these companies, look where the profits are going, look where the market cap has gone up. It's not in, the wireless carriers, it's the companies that don't pay anything for infrastructure.
Right.
They don't invest $30 billion a year like we do, that reap far outsized profits. And meanwhile, we're competing. You don't see any ads for Google, use us, not DuckDuckGo on the Super Bowl, but you see all of the wireless carriers fighting and offering consumers more megabits for less, down 98% increase in price per megabit since 2011. I mean, we've invested enormous amounts, and there's a lot of talk today about ISPs and pricing, and in fact, consumers are getting a great deal. Now, rural Americans, it is a tougher business model out there, and things like RDOF matter when the FCC puts out $20 billion to help fill that gap, and universal service needs to be targeted to help build out in rural America, and an infrastructure bill that would help, that business case to get us to that last mile in rural America is really essential. I hope we can get bipartisan support for an infrastructure package that will close that gap in rural America and get access out there.
Can you speak of the major impact that the permitting reforms laid out in the Republican package would have in this cost?
Well, every bit of cost is sort of, essential to reduce because there isn't enough capital to go around. I mean, this is what we're talking about here. $30 billion is a massive investment we make virtually every year, but yet it's not enough. And we're talking about the need and the shortfall in rural America. So every dime that goes to expensive and costly delays is one dime less going to a worker from CWA or one dime less go into getting broadband out to actually investing it in the network so we can get further into rural America. So we very much appreciate the thoughtful consideration. I think, most rural areas, frankly, are a little bit better about being reasonable. They recognize they need the investment. We sometimes have much tougher time in urban and in suburban districts, frankly, getting, permitting done. But some rural areas are tough too. And, like I say, every dime that's saved even in a suburban area on needless, fees, et cetera, why would you tax broadband when it's saving people's lives every day, connecting
Right.
people to telehealth?
I agree. So let me ask you, would you support adding like an FCC study to the Affordable Internet Act, HR 7302, which you spoke about in your testimony?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more data we get on this, the better. So I think that would be a useful tool.
Okay. Well, with that, I'm out of time. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back, and we thank him. Let's see. Next is Mr. O'Halloran. Are you there, Tom? Tom, you need to unmute if you're there.
I'm there.
Okay, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta for holding a hearing, and for our panelists. It's been a great discussion. I greatly appreciate this committee's continued focus on closing the digital divide, which still impacts far too many Americans in rural America, Indian country, and throughout urban America too. In rural Arizona, only 66% of population has access to broadband at the FCC's minimum speed standard. It's far worse than that in my district. I'm thankful that last Congress, this committee bipartisanly had efforts that resulted in an omnibus package that with programs to help the underserved, such as the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, to address broadband affordability, nearly $1.3 billion in dedicated funding, to expand broadband on the tribal lands at tribal colleges, universities, and minority institutions, and new federal offices to better coordinate multiple broadband programs and more. There's clearly more work to be done to expand broadband access nationwide. We must continue working together across the aisle to help them implement these new programs and improve existing programs as well. I guess my biggest issue is that if we don't do that working across the aisle, we're going to continue to see, as it was mentioned earlier, issues raised in 2006 and still not recognized as being accomplished by now. We're still going to get to the point that we are today, that rural America has basically been forgotten for a couple of decades to get us to where we are competitive for our towns, our cities, our economic development, our hospitals, and our children's education. Mr. Shelton, in your testimony, you discussed how the FCC's Universal Service Fund is relying on a declining contribution base, which supports many critical programs. Could you highlight the importance of funding a bipartisan and consensus-based path forward to provide stability to the CSF contribution methodology in a way that preserves the success of its programs, helping underserved Americans?
Now, the Universal Service Fund only takes into consideration voice, taxes on voice, and voice keeps going down. And we have to figure out ways to make sure that Universal Service Fund is actually applied to broadband, because broadband is the future here, as everybody said, and that there's places in this country, rural places, not mostly, but a lot of rural places that companies are not willing to go in and put in broadband because it's too expensive. Well, we have to figure out a way to have those companies, by private and public partnerships, to get access in rural places, because people in rural places need broadband just like Anybody in an urban environment needs broadband. And my members are willing to go to wherever they can to put it in. The other thing that I have to say here is there's been some talk about a shortage of telecommunications technicians to do this work. Well, I can tell you that the big companies have laid off tens of thousands of my members who are absolutely trained and ready to go anywhere they need to go tomorrow morning or this afternoon to put in broadband and maintain broadband. So, you know, the Universal Service Fund is just one of the ways to do this, but without public and private partnerships, we're never going to get this done. And we got to get it done because this country cannot go on like this.
Thank you, Mr. Shelton. Dr. Anderson, thank you for everything you do to help our students during this pandemic. My wife's a former educator. Could you briefly discuss the specific needs tribal students are facing in your community to distance learn due to lack of access to connected devices or fixed services?
And I'll speak to really a compliment to what Mr. Shelton shared. It's infrastructure. And so we have tribal students that they don't have the infrastructure in place, much like our rural students as well, but they don't have the infrastructure in place. So there really can be almost extreme isolation in terms of access and ability. The kinds of things that we might provide other students right in the city of Topeka is not as accessible because those students and those families, the manner where they live, even the libraries and the buildings that they have, doesn't have any infrastructure in those tribal organizations to be able to serve those students as well as we should. I do want to mention, although I know this wasn't part of the question, our rural America piece. When we gave out that map, what we learned really quickly is, much like our tribal students, they didn't have access to the store for Wi-Fi. They didn't have access to a McDonald's for Wi-Fi. They didn't have access to any other places that inner city Topeka had access to. So again, that infrastructure is the issue. And so even with the items that we began to provide, if there's no infrastructure in place, we're just putting a Band-Aid on items.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm way over my time and I yield. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's see. Next, I think we've been asked to go to Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, are you here? I see you.
Yes.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member.
Why do I have to read?
I got to tell you, as I've listened to this hearing, I kind of regretted that we don't have more of our internet providers here today. I feel like they need to defend themselves. And it's not my job to speak for them, but it feels like we've searched the country over for some bad examples during COVID. And I'd like to note that most, if not all of our providers lifted caps or offered free service for limited periods during the start of COVID. I think over 800 of them took the Keep American Connected pledge. I don't know, it just feels like that some in this hearing would focus on punitive measures rather than seeing these as partners and people who can actually help us solve our problems. The committee might be interested to know that before I came to Congress, we all brought very different backgrounds. I served as the mayor of a city and we were actually able to work with the private sector. And for the last 7 years, the residents of my city have had free internet. And that wouldn't happen without partnering with these good partners. Now, I can tell you from this experience, there's more to the challenge than just getting free internet to everybody. We struggled with devices and even getting people to take free internet. Through this experience, I also learned, because I inherited a broadband network, just how difficult it is for government to run a broadband network. And I wish we could have a whole hearing just on that. I'd love to share more thoughts, but let me pivot just quickly. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues, Mr. Duncan and Armstrong, who worked on this issue and introduced some legislation. Mr. Edelstein, in my rural Utah, we received quite a few public dollars, but our bottleneck is the federal bureaucracy and removing barriers. We've heard today how we've removed too many barriers. How do we streamline our federal permitting process so that we can get to these areas where that is the bottleneck?
You're absolutely right. I mean, trying to decide on federal lands is such a nightmare that a lot of my members that want to make private investments can't do it or shy away because it just can take a decade to get sited on federal lands. And a lot of those in rural areas where we talk about rural shortage, and administration after administration has tried, going back to the Clinton administration, to Bush, to Obama to Trump, everybody's tried to get this thing done. I think we need real federal leadership, whether it takes legislation or getting the President Biden to focus a working group to get these agencies together to make sure that they are permitting leases in an expedited fashion, not putting undue burdens on private sector investors that want to build a tower or a network on federal lands, but are stymied. It's incredible how difficult it is to get through that. And I know that you've talked about a bill that allows the Department of Interior to use FCC maps that you've introduced and would help siting process on federal lands. I was the chairman of a working group that the FCC had in the so-called BDAC on federal lands. We had a unanimous report. We laid out, I would like to submit for the record that report, if that's okay. It outlines in great detail all the steps the federal government can take to facilitate siting on federal lands.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask that we submit that report for the record. And you point out very well, these lands that I have in my district, most people don't understand this, they're 90% federal lands, and it can take a decade to permit across these. Also, thank you for giving my bill a shout out, the Federal Broadband Deployment in Underserved Areas Act. One, it's trying to get these federal agencies to coordinate better. And one of my questions to you is, do we need more collaboration with state and local partners? It's clear from this hearing that we all have very, very different districts. And if we're trying to legislate one way from the federal government, it's near impossible. What's your thought on getting local and state governments more involved?
Well, I think so, and tribal governments as well. Tribal areas you talked about. I've worked in that when I used to run the RUS and worked with the Gila River Nation, and there is major roadblocks on tribal lands, which are the most underserved in the United States. I come from Indian country myself in South Dakota, and it's just kind of tragic because nobody needs it more and has worse conditions, and yet no place is it harder to get siting done. So I think working with tribal lands, working with state governments together cooperatively, because there's a lot of state land as well where it's very difficult to get sited. We all agree on the goal. It's just getting the bureaucracy to let us invest and serve those populations.
Thank you. I'm regretfully out of time, but in my district, I have this trifecta of public lands, Native American issues, and rural. And boy, that is a tough combination. Thank you, and to our other witnesses for being with us today.
Gentleman yields back. Thanks, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes Mr. Welsh for 5 minutes. Peter, are you here? Unmute if you are.
Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to pick up where my colleague, Mr. Curtis, left off, because I think what he showed, and also Mark Wayne Mullen, is how when we talk about broadband, ultimately we get down to the very particular circumstances in a very particular location. And it's not a one size fits all deal. And my sense on our committee is that, number one, there's total support to get affordable and accessible broadband throughout America. Number two, there's a dispute, maybe just an emphasis about how best to do it. There's a point of view that more deregulation, more consolidation will get that done. In some places that actually might work, but in the case of Vermont, deregulation and consolidation has led to less access and higher cost. So it may be that we have to be particular and not general about when the various tools can help us achieve the shared goal. I want to ask Mr. Adelstein, and this sort of exemplifies our dilemma here. We have a town in Vermont, Peacham, Vermont. 732 people live there. If you're on one side of Max Mountain Road, and there's about 15 families there, they can't get high-speed internet. And they've got Charter Spectrum, that's a company that does it. When they call, there is no answer. They just won't do it. Now, I understand that economically they may not want to, but they have a territory where unless they do it, it's not going to be available. Can you explain to me what we do about that, Mr. Adelstein?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a public-private partnership to get these out to rural areas. I've spoken to you
be specific. I want to, I'm on the phone and wanting to get Charter Spectrum to do it. So I'm the person who needs the internet. How do I get it when they won't answer the phone? They won't do the job. You say public-private partnership, and in all candor, it sounds like the rhetoric, not the solution.
Well, I'm talking about
Should
federal
the company
investment.
have some obligation in the service territory?
I mean, they're not a member of mine, so I can't speak to that particular, company because we don't represent the cable industry. The wireless, providers
All
do.
right, I'm gonna interrupt. The point I'm trying to make here is that if it's not profitable for a company, whether it's this company or another one, they're not going to invest. So there has to be some federal role here. I'm going to ask Mr. Wood. The problem I just outlined, is that a common problem throughout the country, not just in parts of Vermont?
Yes, Congressman, I think it's definitely a problem. It is a very localized business, even though there are these nationwide players that are working in so many different territories. And the mapping issues that you've led on, that Mr. Loebsack and Mr. McEachin did, Mr. Latta and Long also across the aisle, helped to get that bill passed last year, and the FCC is still working on it. But here we are, almost 12 months later, and we still don't have much better data.
All right, so we had fairy tale maps, but how do we address the situation in Peacham, Vermont, or Mark Wayne Mullins Road, or other places all around the country where we just don't have companies that are willing to make the investment because there's not the return on the investment?
Yeah, I think it has to be about the federal investment or state level or local too. There's lots of ways to get taxpayer dollars into both commercial and cooperative and municipal providers, and we have to be smart about it. So if we don't know where we're lacking service, we see in things like the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, a lot of that money is going to flow to places that need it, and some of it seems to have been misdirected. And so we just need to get better about taking those precious federal dollars we have, realizing this is a huge need, and making sure they go to the right place.
All right, okay, so whether you come at this from the perspective, I'm talking about Mr. Johnson, where he does advocate for deregulation, for instance, we have to have that information, whether it's in Mr. Johnson's district or my district, in order to deploy the money that we do have effectively. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think, as you said, Congressman, it is about profit too. So I want to be clear: ISPs do invest tens of billions of dollars around the country. What we're seeing now, though, is that their investment has been going down for the last few years. Their profits and their subscriber numbers and their revenues are going up, and people are paying higher prices.
By the way, I have total concerns, we all do, for lower income folks. I also have concern for middle class folks who are trying to pay their bills on limited incomes. So there has to be public policy here where we get our rates down, and we shouldn't be paying the highest rate compared to all of the European market competitors. And we do. Is that not correct, Mr.
Yeah,
White?
I think there are different ways to look at the international comparisons. I'm focused on the US figures and the fact that we're seeing broadband prices go up at 4 times the rate of inflation. Again, as investment levels stay high, but trend downwards over these last few years.
See, the gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I think I see Buddy Carter in his mobile office. Buddy, are you ready to take your 5 minutes?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I especially appreciate this hearing, which is so very important, and appreciate all the.
Well, Buddy, I think you're frozen there.
Am I frozen?
Okay, I think we can hear you again. Try it again.
Okay, Mr. Edelstein, I wanted to ask you, a lot of your testimony has focused really on permitting and siting reforms and how any funding should go hand in hand with those efforts. I just wanted to ask you, could you tell me some of the top issues that are facing the wireless industry now when it comes to expediting build out?
Well, the top issue really is just having enough capital to build to the entire country. I think that, it's very important in terms of bipartisan infrastructure bill that we get a substantial investment to be able to get to that last mile in rural America. We talked about with Congressman Welch. The business case gets tougher as you get out there, and having costly burdens makes it more difficult to make that happen. I mean, for example, you introduced a bill I saw in the package that takes Section 6409 and makes it so they're not subject to NEPA or NIPA, which is something that the FCC has worked on. I think, these kind of pieces of legislation to codify some of the good work the FCC has done would be helpful, particularly for co-location. Again, it should be the easiest thing to do if you're going to co-locate, if you're going to upgrade so you can get service out to more people. That should be the last place you find the regulatory hurdles, and we appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, and appreciate you bringing up my bill and mentioning it. It's called the Proportional Reviews for Broadband Development Act. It's really just common sense. And it really just says that, the changes, unless they're significant, but these minor changes that don't really impact the footprint of a tower, of a wireless tower, that those won't have to go through the environmental or the historical review, and that this would speed things up, which would expedite this and help everyone and obviously save us a lot of money. Can you think of give us any examples where this has happened before?
Absolutely. I mean, regularly we're trying to co-locate on an existing tower, and there could be an environmental or historic review. What has changed in the history since you put a tower up there and you're trying to put more equipment on a tower that's already been sitting there, and you've already done an historic review, you can do it again sometime? I mean, this is just, it could take a year. It could take, quite a bit of time, and there's no more environmental impact. There's no historic impact. There's a tower sitting there. So, it's just common sense. And this is something that the federal government has within its own authority to apply federal rules to something that's so nonsensical on an area where the federal government is trying to get broadband out there. I think that kind of reasonable step, the municipalities won't be upset about it because it applies to the federal government, not municipalities. And it makes perfect sense.
And obviously it has a monetary impact, but the time factor too. I mean, if a child misses a year, has got to wait a year in order to get high-speed internet, I mean, that's a year behind that they are.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We're talking about 5G, which will allow school children to do all kinds of things they can't do with multidimensional learning, 3D. It'll be very exciting for school kids. We've seen how important distance learning is now with the pandemic. Let's get that 5G equipment up there and not have to wait a year more for an historic environmental review when there's already a perfectly good wireless facility sitting there. Get that piece of equipment up there more quickly. And this supports the efforts that the FCC has done to streamline the treatment of existing facilities under Section 6409.
I was at the Georgia State Legislature today, and they were making a big push. You've always heard Georgia. There are two Georgias. There's Atlanta and everywhere else. We have a large rural community in Georgia, and one of the things that they're talking about is cell reception mapping, and especially during the pandemic. How are your members addressing the mapping issue?
Well, I'm very pleased that this committee is funding for mapping that was approved by Congress, because we do need to have more accurate maps. If you're going to target where you have uncertain areas, you need to know where they are. And it's been an issue we've worked on for many years trying to improve those maps. And the FCC needed those funds provided late last year in the bill. So we're grateful for that. I think that'll finally enable us to get more accurate maps and target relief where it's needed.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Now yield back.
Okay, thank you, buddy. Let's see. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes. Tony, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
You're recognized.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Ranking Member Lotta. Thank you for having this important hearing. I just want to point out that once again that at the end of December of last year, Congress passed a $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit program, which will provide eligible folks across America with a discount of up to $50 per month towards their internet bills. In addition, eligible households can receive a one-time discount of up to $100 to purchase a device or a tablet or laptop or desktop, etc. This benefit will be critical for those who are desperately in need of being able to be connected. And we all know that when you're not connected, you have issues of not being able to get your telehealth appointment, not being able to get the opportunity to get back to work by filling out those employment contracts. And also when it comes to children missing school, it's now been over a year and many of our children around the country are falling behind, way behind. And it's really important that we get this right. And also Mr. Wood and Mr. Shelton, you provided concerning testimony about how communities of color are most likely to be caught on the wrong side of the digital divide. And this is something that existed before this pandemic. Mr. Wood, how can we make sure that people that most desperately need the help will know about the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program and how to access it? And how do we capture people who are not currently in the Lifeline program today, but are still eligible for the broadband benefit?
Thank you, Congressman. We definitely need to make sure we do that. Obviously, the higher dollar amount available and the more robust plans people can get will hopefully help with that, but it can't just be a set it and forget it kind of approach. We need to make sure that there is outreach in local communities, that there's advertising, that it's in the dominant languages in different communities and not just in English or even just in Spanish. It has to be in any language that a community is populated with. And there has to be a support. So as I said earlier, I think we need centralized information from the FCC, but also localized information and efforts on the ground to make sure that however well the program is designed, people know about it and they can take advantage of it.
And that awareness is definitely an opportunity for public-private partnership, right?
For sure. I mean, the ISPs are a big part of this. They've been good partners in this thus far. We don't have the FCC's rules yet, but the companies have a self-interest here. They will get this money back in terms of reimbursement, hopefully for people paying more for a plan, but having the taxpayers help them out with that in this crucial time to make sure everybody is connected.
And also when people are uplifted economically, then they can afford long-term these opportunities to keep these kinds of services once they graduate from being low income and unemployed. Similarly, Mr. Wood, many multifamily residence rentals are multi-dwelling units, such as senior and student living mobile home parks. They have a bulk billing agreements with internet service providers. Because these residents are not directly billed for services, but instead pay a monthly fee for broadband services to their landlords, these households would otherwise be eligible. And they'd also be likely to receive the emergency broadband benefit to help pay their internet bills. Again, how do we ensure that residents of these multifamily rental properties, including those in public housing, are eligible and able to receive this incredibly important benefit?
For sure, that's a key, and that's why the statute is written as it is, and the Lifeline program operates in this way too. We talk about households, and so that means a family unit or other group of people who decide to live together and make a household together. It's not just about a single physical address. As you said, sometimes many different people share the same physical address, and sometimes people don't have a permanent physical address for the unhoused populations or those who are moving from place to place. So really, we need to focus on the household and not just the physical address in that case.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Wood. I'd also like to share that my colleagues and I are planning to send a letter to the FCC asking them to expand eligibility for this program to be as inclusive as possible. We must eliminate potential barriers and maximize the number of households that are able to receive this incredibly important monthly broadband benefit so that we can help families across America stay online and connected. I have a question for Mr. Shelton. How long does it take for somebody to be trained to become one of your members? Do they have to go out there and get a PhD? Is it 7 years of training, or about how long does it take?
It's all done on the job, and it's I would say to be fully trained, it probably takes a couple of years. But you know, the folks that
but you could be on the job training within weeks or months, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you could actually start feeding your family while you're being trained.
Yeah, and we would love to have you start feeding your family while you're being trained. The problem is that we're losing members in the tens of thousands, and that could be putting all these broadband connections in that are fully trained already.
Okay.
Gentlemen's
thank you
time
very
has
much.
expired.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let's see. I see Jeff Duncan sitting there patiently. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get started, I'd like to enter into the record the Wahlberg workforce letter dated January 27th from Mr. Edelstein and others. I think staff has that.
Sure, without objection. So ordered.
Thank you. This is my first hearing on the Telecom Subcommittee, so let me take a moment to say it's a privilege to be here. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to address the issues that come before the subcommittee. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention a giant in the communication realm passed away today. That was Rush Limbaugh, and 70-year-old, died of cancer, and he's going to be missed within the communication realm. You know, in the 1930s, after dual disasters of the Civil War and Reconstruction had left the rural South nearly a century behind the industrialized North in terms of technology, President Roosevelt made a decision to work to electrify the South with hydropower, and Universal Service Fund was born. And out of that also came rural electric cooperatives, who have been providing these important services to my constituents for about 8 decades now. I believe that after electricity and telephone services, broadband internet is the third wave of infrastructure investments needed to keep rural America competitive with our urban compatriots. And I will say I live on that last mile as well. I'm served by a rural telephone cooperative and a rural electric cooperative. So with any of these infrastructure build outs, I believe the federal taxpayer deserves the maximum return of investment for every dollar they spend. That doesn't just mean lower cost up front. It means those investments need to be in infrastructure that lasts and stands the test of time. For the purposes of this conversation, I believe that that means fiber optic cable on the ground. More expensive up front, I get that, but with a much longer service life and much greater reliability down the road. This also means, as Mr. Edelstein has testified today, that we need to reform the permitting process in ways that will allow installation of these assets more quickly and more cost effectively than has been done to date. Another way we can maximize our ROI is not to try to reinvent the wheel. The electric cooperatives are in a unique position to take advantage of existing and new federal programs with the greatest impact at the least amount of cost to the taxpayer. I believe this means, whenever possible, partnering and creating synergy with the cooperatives to ensure that the power lines and fiber optic cable move together to provide the services necessary to close the homework gap and rural broadband gap. And finally, I believe it's absolutely necessary to have the right data before we make these decisions. If we're going to invest billions of taxpayer dollars in these assets, we must simply ensure that we are not duplicating our efforts and wasting those dollars. That can be achieved by making sure we're using data that maps to the rooftop, not just to a census block. And we need to have that level of precise detail before we spend to add broadband services. So I thank you for having this hearing today. You know, the government doesn't set pricing for telephone, satellite TV, water, or electricity. And I don't think the government should set the pricing for rural broadband as well. And so I want to ask Mr. Edelstein. Mr. Edelstein, some witnesses have expressed concerns about broadband prices in the United States. Do you think the competitive marketplace or the government should determine the price of communication services?
Well, the private sector is doing a fantastic job. I don't know where some of these numbers come from. I mean, the cost per megabit has gone down 98% in the last 10 years, 98%. You know, you can look at the price 9 years ago for a plan, $114 for a one line unlimited. Now that plan costs $64.95, a decline of 52% inflation adjusted. I mean, these are subscribers save $576 a year compared to 2010 prices. So if Matt wants to go back to, you know, a 2015, 2014 plan, we'll sell you one. You won't get nearly the same deal. The market is working very well. It's highly competitive. I mean, you can see that the ads on television trying to get those prices down is working. The competitive marketplace in wireless has reduced costs dramatically per megabit, and people are getting much better service at lower prices. As a matter of fact, wireless drove down the overall CPI for the first time, you know, in 7 years in 2017. We reduced the CPI. So I'm not sure where some of these numbers are coming from, because wireless, actually prices have been going down, lowering the overall CPI for the United States to the point where actually it declined as a result of wireless in 2017. And it's been lowering inflation consistently. And we have the stats I could submit for the record to prove that.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And you know, I hear you saying that the marketplace competition, we're in our infancy in broadband services and even cellular realistically compared to telecommunications. And so competition will drive the price down. When companies compete, I save money. Do you think it's a market failure that suggests that government should set the broadband prices? I don't hear you saying that. It's not a market failure.
The market's working. I think a 98% reduce in the price per megabit is pretty effective in the marketplace.
Yep.
Well, I'm out of time. I appreciate you being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let's see. Next, I believe we have Robin Kelly. Robin, are you there? Yes, I see.
Yes, I am.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's an honor for me to be on your committee. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. The pandemic continues to shine a light on the broadband problem, but the digital divide has been an issue in this country for such a long time. In my district, which is urban, suburban, and rural, there are still areas that lack connectivity. As of 2017, I worked with local government officials and industry to bring Wi-Fi to Pembroke Township, one of my rural areas in Kankakee County in Illinois. It was the first time that the town was connected to high-speed wireless internet. Pembroke shows that what we can accomplish if we all work together. We can close the digital divide, but it's going to take all of us working together, government, industry, and consumers. More liberal-leaning organizations and large companies like Verizon have put out ideas to close the digital divide. This shows me that we can come together on common sense ideas to address the digital divide, even on topics like affordability and municipal broadband. I encourage other companies to join in taking a long-term view and come forward with their ideas for closing the digital divide so we can drive real solutions to these problems. Mr. Wood, the emergency broadband benefit is likely the fastest way that we can get more people connected without having to create unique tiers or plans. How do you think the program should evolve to ensure customers are getting a good product and ISPs are holding up their end?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think it really is about that choice and making sure people can apply that up to $50. It would be less than that if they can get a plan for less than that, to whatever service tier they would like. And so giving people that kind of choice and that kind of robust investment in their own ability to connect is what we see as the key to making sure that program succeeds.
Okay, and Mr. Edelstein, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think you're right. My wife's from Chicago. I appreciate the work that you've done to get Wi-Fi out there. She's from the northern part, and you're from the southern. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of progress we need to make. I think this committee's making the right investments in the emergency broadband fund and making sure that people can afford it. That is a real issue, and we need to work together with you to help people afford it. And the prices, as I've said, are the service is going up, prices are going down, but it's still not affordable to some people. And because this is so essential, it's really something that we need to work together. And I think this committee's doing a great job on that front.
Good. And even in Chicago, where they had the connectivity program, some parents still did not take advantage of that because I guess they were afraid because they owed Comcast or whoever they owed them money. So they were afraid to get back on to connect, even though it was for e-learning. As chair of the CBC Health Brain Trust, I've witnessed COVID-19 devastate communities of color, and the relief efforts that benefited others often never reach minority communities. In particular, I'm concerned by the lack of transparency in the FCC's COVID-19 telehealth program. Congress just appropriated another $250 million for this program in December. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you talked about the lack of telehealth services available to Native populations in your state. How can the FCC better use this new pot of money to ensure that communities of color, including Native populations, benefit from the telehealth program?
Well, and just so that we're all on the same page in terms of even that impact, and thank you for asking that question, I want to speak to just Kansas. As we know, the FCC has over 600,000 Native households that lack standard broadband access. It's truly an issue. That is 4 times higher than the general population. And so, as we think about what can be done, and we talk about, I know it sounds like rhetoric, private-public partnerships, but I think there are some accountability measures that we certainly need to put in place and ask for. I think transparency is definitely an issue, and I think what you shared in that regard is also an issue, and then collecting data to make sure that we hold people accountable. At this point in Kansas, we have several tribal areas that do not have any access, and so even though we have a reduced cost of broadband services in some areas, that's not accessible to our communities of color and to our tribal groups. And so I would suggest many of the things that have already been shared, but that transparency, data collection, and holding of accountability. Right now, that 600,000 Native households lacking access, it's unacceptable.
No, I definitely agree. It's unacceptable anywhere.
Absolutely.
For you starting. Mr. Chair, I will yield back my 3 seconds.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding back. Let's see, I don't see any Republicans right now. We're going to go to Angie Craig. Angie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for running a very efficient meeting. I'm really grateful that the committee's taken the time here today to tackle this issue of dependable and affordable broadband. At the end of the last Congress, I was proud to support the Broadband Data Act to make sure that the FCC produces accurate, reliable, and granular maps of broadband coverage. Additionally, in the omnibus package at the end of the year, Congress again came together to provide the funds necessary for the agency to begin developing the maps. I know my colleague Buddy Carter brought this up, but even with the funding that Congress provided, it's going to be, we all know, a Herculean task for the FCC to coordinate the numerous efforts throughout the FCC and the federal government to improve broadband mapping. That's why earlier this week, I introduced the Broadband Measuring Availability and Aligning Policies Task Force Act, Broadband Maps Act. This bill directs the chair of the FCC to create an intra-agency task force to ensure that all of the appropriate parts of the agency are working in the same direction to produce these accurate maps. Just this morning, the acting chairwoman announced she'll be implementing my bill administratively. I thank the acting chairwoman for her partnership. In wake of COVID-19, Congress has put substantial investment into broadband. We've got to make sure that these maps are accurate to ensure federal dollars get to the most underserved communities. Mr. Wood, could you please discuss the importance of accurate mapping and also speak to the importance of mapping when planning broadband build out, and also just as someone who is brand new to this subcommittee, talk a little bit about the barriers that have existed to make sure that these maps are accurate.
Yes, Congresswoman, it's not a very pleasant story. I mean, it doesn't seem like it should take this long, but there is finally some movement. Thank you for that bill and for the FCC's willingness to take it on. I think it was last March, as I mentioned earlier, that the Mapping Act passed, and the FCC also has had a proceeding underway to try and implement that. They call it the Digital Opportunity Data Collection. And only an administrative lawyer like me could love this. They're on something like their third order to consider how to do that. So we are moving in the right direction, as you said, but sometimes it takes a lot of nudges or even shoves in that direction to get things done. And I think there was $65 million set aside for the FCC in December to fund that mapping program, and industry is ready to go and to get there. So as we've seen, without the maps, in even the well-intentioned Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction that just concluded, we can send money to places that are actually served today. Sometimes those maps actually understate coverage. As often, if not more often, they overstate coverage. And until we get that right, we're going to be putting money in places that it doesn't need to go and leaving other places unfunded, even though they desperately need that kind of federal investment.
Well, as someone who's new to understanding all of this, I look forward to trying to understand why this is so difficult and what those barriers are, and how we can either help eliminate those barriers or get out of the way, depending on the issue. I'd like to just switch slightly now to broadband's impact on our educators. As the wife of an educator and the mother to a son who is in the basement here today doing distance learning, and who's moving back to hybrid learning here in the next couple of weeks. I know that the stress this has put on our parents, our educators, and our students. Dr. Anderson, in your testimony, you mentioned the importance of the expansion of the E-rate program. Can you talk a little more about the financial burden that the pandemic has placed on school districts who are trying to connect their students and teachers, and additionally, how Congress can continue to assist our teachers in deploying this new teaching technologies meant to help make all of this effective for our students?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. And when we talk about the financial burden, let me make sure that I speak about specifics. So if you're not in a school, and I love it that your son is in the basement, but if you don't have a son in the basement and you don't know, reality is if your child is on free or reduced lunch and you're someone on reduced lunch, that's about 70 cents for breakfast and lunch. In Topeka, if you wanted service, internet services, we do have a partnership. You could pay $10. I literally had a parent that emailed one of our principals at Jardine Middle School to let them know that they actually had to give up lunch to pay for service unless something else happened. And so we were able, with a grant, to be able to help in that case, but that's a burden for families, even the reduced costs. So right now, those costs are really being shifted to families. They have to literally pick, am I going to eat, or am I going to actually be able to provide service? So that's one piece in terms of connectivity and just that continued burden. You know, the other pieces of burden financially, and I'll talk about E-rate, 80% of our internet services is through E-rate for Topeka Public Schools, 80%. And so we rely heavily on that within the school system. Now, I will tell you that it's not just infrastructure. I know my time is out, but let me tell you this, 50% of our families in Topeka right now, while they may have internet, and this is not unusual for free lunch families, they don't have quality internet. They can't get the videos, they can't access, they don't have the speed. And so that, again, puts the burden on families, or they just do without. And we're seeing more and more doing without.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. And as I'm way out of time, Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Let's see, Mr. Butterfield, I believe you're next and you're recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, wait, I see Mr. Wahlberg just come on the screen and he's their last speaker. Tim, are you able to hear me? Yeah, I will recognize you for 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Tim. Tim, you're still muted. Can you hear me? If you can, you need to unmute. Well, Tim, maybe we'll go to Mr. Butterfield and try to come back to you. Are you unmuted?
Did that work now?
Yeah. Okay, there you are. You got 5 minutes.
Okay, it's the fingers were too big to get the job done there. So I appreciate you taking the time with me on this, and I appreciate the fact that this issue has been brought up today. It's an important topic that we would do well to spend significant time on. If I can bring up my, why don't you go on to Mr. Butterfield, if I could ask that. I'm having trouble getting my questions up.
Okay, we'll do that. Thanks, Tim. We'll come back to you. Okay, Mr. Butterfield, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership. We've been working on this for a very long time, and it's time to get something done in the 117th Congress. Thank you very much. And to our witnesses, thank you as well for your testimony. Let me start with Mr. Wood. Mr. Wood, could you just talk, please, a little bit more about the EBB program, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, specifically the benefits of consumers being able to choose from a wide variety of broadband providers and service offerings? Help me a little bit with that.
Certainly, Congressman, happy to. It is a much larger available amount of money, which will help with that flexibility. And so, you know, the current Lifeline program, as I've mentioned, is usually limited to $9.25 per subscriber. This could go up to $50 or $75 on tribal lands, and that will allow people to get a more robust plan, wired or wireless. Frankly, we thought at our organization it was important not to try and pick and choose for people what they should pick for themselves, and that they should be able to take that money and apply it to any of those services that they might find best suits their needs in this very unusual and extraordinary crisis we find ourselves in. And perhaps going forward, I mean, we need to think about making this permanent and doing other things to lower prices people are paying. But this was a great start in our view to get people that injection of cash they need now.
So you're a strong proponent on flexibility in the EBB program. Are you supportive of flexibility, and do you think that would be important to making the program successful?
Yes, definitely. And I think I should say, you know, I feel like there's a little talking past each other today. We've talked a lot about competition at our organization and about this program as well. And so not trying to remake the broadband market or how we set prices or anything like that with this program or frankly any other. We just want to make sure people have what they need to get those services, even as, despite what we've heard, prices are going up at the bottom end, and especially recently. I think the problem with Commissioner Adelstein's testimony versus mine is he was talking about 2017. I'm talking about 2020. We saw wireless CPI spike last year, even though wireless has been more competitive for a while for sure. But once the T-Mobile Sprint merger went through, prices started to shoot back up. And that's what we have to be concerned about, is that people not be left behind as they're putting more out of their pocket, whatever's happening with the quality adjusted prices for people like me who can already afford the service.
Let me switch over very briefly to Commissioner Adelstein. It's good to see you again, sir. I wish I could be there with you in person, but thank you for all that you do for the Wireless Infrastructure Association. In your testimony, you discussed the need for apprenticeship programs to ensure a diversity pipeline of job-ready workers who will then be instrumental in delivering broadband to those who need it the most. We've talked about that, and I know how strongly you feel about this. How might these apprenticeship programs help us close the digital divide?
Well, our industry is committed to diversity, and I appreciate all your leadership over the years to do that. I think that we want our workforce to look like the people that we serve, which is as diverse as the United States is. And apprenticeships are a great way to get people of color, veterans, disadvantaged communities, women involved in our industry, to diversify the workforce and to give them skills where they can have jobs that continue to grow as our industry grows. Apprenticeships are perfect for wireless. That's why Secretary of Labor Welsh has lauded the efforts that we're doing there. We started the first diverse program in the industry, but we need a lot more work. And I think one way we could work together with you, and we talked about, is to go to HBCUs and tribal colleges to have them teach programs that don't exist in almost any school today about 5G, to really get kids. Now, Carnegie Mellon.
What about community colleges? Community colleges. I know we talked about that. Yes.
Yeah, community colleges can do the field tech work and get people into whether they go to CWA or they go to one of the other companies that are doing this kind of work. They could come out fully trained, ready to go, and start in 5G. This is the most complex technology yet, in the most complex generation. And I think at HBCUs, you've got Carnegie Mellon cranking out great EEs, but we need a lot more of them. We can't just do it at MIT and Carnegie Mellon. We need them at HBCUs. This would be a great place to get higher skilled workers, more diversified engineers, RF engineers.
You mentioned Communication Workers of America. Let me next go to Mr. Shelton. Thank you for all that your union does. We are great friends and just want to encourage you to keep doing what you guys have been doing over the years. In your testimony, Mr. Shelton, you say that strengthening the Lifeline program is key to promoting digital equity among communities that have been left behind. My question is, what reforms could we make to the Lifeline program that will address the digital divide?
Well, the Lifeline program needs to be strengthened, and I think we need to talk about how it gets strengthened. But I think one of the things that would probably destroy the Lifeline program is to put it being funded by yearly congressional appropriations, which would leave it to the vagaries of Congress. Sorry to say, I think that the Lifeline program is too important to do that, and I think that we would really hurt it or destroy it if that happens. So
Lifeline has a lot of support on this committee, I believe, on both sides of the aisle. So thank you so much for your words. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah. I thank the gentleman. Tim, are you ready?
I hope so. You can tell me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good. I'm glad I can make technology work the second time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All of us here have recognized the importance of staying connected during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we should take pride in the fact that our networks here in the U.S. were able to withstand the stress test of increased capacity. I'm told that in other parts of the world, Europe and Australia, for example, regulators were forced to take extraordinary measures, such as reducing video quality and speeds, and even urging consumers to ration their internet usage. There's no doubt about it. The light touch regulatory framework that has governed the internet for most of its existence has enabled us to build resilient networks. But there's much more to be done, and the digital divide is more prominent than ever. Recently, Jennifer, a constituent of mine from Manchester, Michigan, wrote to me that she has to drive her kids to a nearby business parking lot so that children can complete their school assignments. This is unacceptable, and we must continue to work towards permanent broadband solutions that meet the needs of rural and urban America. As part of the solution, I'm pleased to introduce with my colleagues common sense permitting reforms that will remove red tape, will lower deployment costs, and allow companies to put resources towards skilled workforce training and apprenticeship programs to meet the needs of next generation broadband technology. In fact, in my district alone, it's estimated that the 5G economy will create over 6.6 thousand new jobs and almost 90,000 jobs in the state of Michigan over the next 10 years. This is why I'm pleased to introduce with my Democrat colleague, Representative Clark, the Telecommunications Skilled Force Act, H.R. 1032. This bill will help foster greater collaboration between the federal government, state workforce boards, higher education, and industry to accomplish the ultimate goal of reducing unemployment and developing a pipeline of skilled technicians that our country sorely needs to meet our broadband and 5G deployment goals. Mr. Adelstein, yesterday I spoke with Dr. Kojo Courtney, president of the Monroe County Community College, about workforce training initiatives. Many players in the telecom industry are collaborating with institutions like Monroe County Community College to address the significant shortage of skilled workers to build out 5G and fiber networks. Could you elaborate on the role that community and technical colleges can play in helping to deploy advanced wireless and wired broadband services?
Absolutely. We appreciate the bipartisan leadership of you and Congresswoman Clark, and we just heard from Congressman Butterfield about apprenticeships and the role that they can play in making sure that we have, really the latest skills to our workforce. And Monroe County Community College is leading the way. As a matter of fact, at Monroe County Community College, we are together with our partners at PCCA creating the first small cell technician program at any school in the country. So Michigan is leading the way. I mean, small cells are a whole new technology. We're going to put as many of 1 million of these things up. And it gets very complicated because you're putting more antennas closer to end users, which leads to a congested RF environment. And most field techs have never had a course in radio frequency engineering, just a 101. So when they're out there in the field, they know what they're doing. So we need to, give them, and these are new people coming in the industry. We talked to Congressman Butterfield about diversity. We can get diverse people in there. We get veterans in, women, minorities, and bring them in. People that have been displaced because of the pandemic, train them in wireless technology, especially 5G, because 5G is the most complex G yet. And yet schools across the country aren't teaching it. We've come up really fast. People don't think about, 10 years ago before the iPhone, it was pretty simple. You put up an antenna and you were done. Now you're talking about small cells. You're talking about very complicated equipment at the top of the tower. You're talking about a lot of software engineering. And earlier we talked about cybersecurity. I mean, this is a new world of educational needs. And so we need the academic world to keep up with the fast pace of the wireless industry so that we can get people coming out of our schools that are ready to do the job safely, efficiently. If taxpayers are going to invest money in building it out, let's have people from Monroe County Community College be the ones to build that out with this new degree in small cell engineering.
Super, amazing stuff. Do you agree that permitting reforms such as the proposals recently introduced by Republican members of this subcommittee will help lower deployment costs for providers so they can focus on dedicated resources toward workforce development and apprenticeship programs?
Yeah, it's all part of it, of the deal. If we're going to do an infrastructure package, I think, major investments are in order to get it out to rural America, as you noted. I mean, there's a need for that. We realize now that broadband is essential. So if we get all the elements in place, we get the right siting regime, which you have talked about, you've introduced legislation on that. We get the right spectrum policies, we get the right workforce policies. all three legs of the stool are covered, and we can win the race to 5G. I think we're positioned to do it. I think we have the smartest workforce, the smartest engineers. We have, some great cooperation with Congress, with the FCC. We've won the race to 4G through some partnership and cooperation. I think we can win the race to 5G, and we can make sure that it gets to rural America so that our entire economy can grow with as much as 4.5 million new jobs.
Okay, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Expired.
I yield back.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Now, we've saved the best member for last. It is my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to my good friend and colleague from California, Doris Matsui.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and you're the best chairman too. I'll give that to you also. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And this is such an important subject. First of all, I want to talk about cybersecurity, K-12. While the shift to distant learning has helped keep students safe and engaged, it has also highlighted a growing threat. Cyber attacks targeting schools that are increasing in regularity and sophistication. In December, the FBI, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center issued a joint cybersecurity advisory noting that the significant risk of cyber attacks is expected to continue during the current academic year. Dr. Anderson, have you heard concerns about this disruption to distance learning that a cyber attack could cause?
Trying to get this unmuted. Here we go. First of all, thank you for that question. One of the things Topeka has done most recently is to have a full audit of our security systems. And I would encourage that, again, if we have the appropriate resources to free up instead of directing them to other matters that could be addressed by E-rate and other items. If we have those resources available, everyone could actually do that. From our own audit that we had, we really began doing some other matters to further protect our students and our staff as it relates to ensuring that we are not open to the kinds of threats that we would otherwise be open to.
Okay.
That's going to be an ongoing audit as well.
Okay, thank you. Last Congress, I introduced the Enhancing K-12 Cybersecurity Act with Congressman Langevin to help increase school cybersecurity during this pandemic and beyond. And just like roads and bridges, cybersecurity staff and technology are an important part of modernizing American infrastructure. And that's why this bill would authorize $400 million in new funding. And while this public health crisis has revealed pre-existing vulnerabilities, this underlying cyber threat facing K-12 schools remain even after we crush the coronavirus. I want to now talk about workforce. In order for the United States to remain the global leader in communications technologies, we need to ensure that there is a skilled workforce ready to install the fiber towers and antennas that power them. However, there is still a significant shortage of qualified workers that is limiting our progress in closing the digital divide and deploying next generation communications networks. That's why I'm working on legislation to boost apprenticeships and job training to meet this demand. Mr. Edelstein, how has limited telecommunications sector workforce funding affected deployment, and what would an additional, let's say, $75 million in apprenticeship grants allow us to accomplish? Mr. Edelstein.
I think it would make a huge difference. Thank you so much. I can see, why you're our Congressional Wireless Workforce Champion. We gave you an award about a year ago because you've been so committed to workforce development and to funding it properly. And apprenticeships are the right way to go, as Congressman Wahlberg was mentioning. Even in cybersecurity, it doesn't have to be just traditional jobs of building out in the field, but you can have a cybersecurity apprenticeship, and we can get kids coming out of technical schools and colleges and HBCUs that are learning cybersecurity specifically for 5G, because again, it's different. I mean, this 5G is a whole new world, and if we want to win that race, we have a lot of good people who do the work, as has been noted in testimony here, that know how to do it. But 5G, we want to make sure that the skills keep up with the development of the technology and the growth of the technology. So if Congress is going to invest, along the lines of Congressman Clyburn's bill, $100 billion, that'll create hundreds of thousands of new jobs to fill. And hopefully, there'll be good union jobs. There'll be good other companies that are doing that work. Make sure that we have people ready to do that and spend those congressional dollars efficiently and effectively, and give people from diverse backgrounds careers in our industry that's going to keep on growing. I mean, our industry isn't going away. We're going to keep growing. And these are really good, well-paying jobs that people can grow in their careers. You know, they can go from being a field tech to being an RF engineer. Your leadership on this has been absolutely essential.
Well, thank you very much for that. I just want to have a few seconds here. I was joined with Congressman Guthrie in sending a letter to the Department of Labor requesting Secretary Acosta, this was last Congress, to provide us with details on steps the department is taking to support the development of a qualified telecommunications workforce. Looking to the future, I believe as an initial step that a 5G and fiber workforce plan must be a foundational strategy for addressing this workforce challenge. Mr. Edelstein, this a quick answer. Do you believe a 5G and fiber workforce plan could help coordinate the disparate federal agencies involved in our telecommunications workforce?
Absolutely. We need to plan ahead for this because it's going to be a big growing demand, especially if we have a big infrastructure package. I'm pleased to say that Secretary Walsh had very positive comments about the importance of wireless apprenticeships in his confirmation hearing and what WA has been doing through TIRAP. So I think we have all the right pieces together, the right people here in the room right now to get the job done.
Okay.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Okay. Now let's see. I want to request unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. A letter from the Fiber Broadband Association to Chairman Doyle. A letter from U.S. Telecom in support of the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. A statement from the Wireless Internet Providers Association. A statement from Philemon Vela. A letter to Ranking Member Latta, from Ranking Member Latta to Chairman Pallone and Doyle. A January 27th Industry Association letter. Study from George S. Floyd, the Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy. Letter from Utilities Technology Council in support of broadband deployment. A January 2018 report from the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. And I would ask the witnesses to respond promptly to any such questions you may receive. I want to thank everybody that have participated in this hearing. And at this time, the committee is adjourned.